Lightning flashed through the air, illuminating the space around them. Everything around was shrouded in a magical haze. Incredible power emanated from this stone. Unknown magical patterns were expressed by a hologram around it. The guy stood with his sword, looking at the magic of this artifact, wondering if this was the same boss room that was called the Grave of Beginners. A huge magical creature made of stone, lightning, and armored in steel seemed like too much of a creepy training. The boss's eyes lit up red and he walked forward. The boy looked at him, trying to figure out how to defeat this monster that was about to strike first. The guy, thrown into the air by powerful magic, collected his thoughts and thought that he had no other choice anyway, and he needed to win. He grabbed his sword and, encouraging himself that he would be able to do it, rushed forward. Everything around him sparkled with purple lightning, the color of his eyes. At that moment, his capabilities were limitless, and he was able to defeat even this monster created by magic. He had unexpected methods of attack, even against hidden enemies that appeared out of nowhere. He circled around his enemy, striking him and trying to find the one that would help him emerge victorious. Having gained enough of a running start, he jumped forward, literally pushing off from the air. Even though the enemy was several times larger and stronger than him, he still had weaknesses, just like anyone else. He smiled in battle. There was not a drop of fear in him, which was an amazing sight. His divine energy dominated the battlefield no matter who was in front of him. He charged at his main opponent, sword thrust forward. The guy saw absolutely everything. Every movement of the enemy did not escape his field of vision, which gave him a great advantage in battle. With the next dash, he dealt with the hated monster and finished clearing the area. He stood proudly next to his defeated enemy, smiling smugly at his success. He was incredibly talented. He was a gaming streamer who was like a god possessed. At the end of the fight, he announced that it was over to those who had missed the moment. Many admiring comments poured in, but among them were those who did not think it was easy. A few months ago, Mr. Ken Bach was approached at the office and asked if he often made mistakes in contracts. He noted how attentive Mr. Kim, who was sitting in the chair opposite, was, to which Mr. Kim emphasized that Ken Bach had not changed at all. Lee Kyung Bak was a salesman in trouble. He was 28 years old. He took out a specially prepared pen for Mr. Kim and asked if he was ready to sign the document. Mr. Kim grimaced and said that it was terrible, but Ken Bach did not understand what he meant and smiled nervously. Mr. Kim said that Ken Bach should have been the best, to which the guy relaxed a little and smiled sincerely. Mr. Kim raised his glass of water and ice, wondering if it was possible to exert oneself on such a day. This was how business had been conducted since ancient times, and one should at least have a drink before signing documents. Ken Bach returned to his forced smile and gave a forced laugh, promising to remember such subtleties, even though his head was actually splitting. But the next moment he was shaken by the thought that this could be a sign, or rather some kind of ominous warning. Ken Bach had heard from certain sources that Mr. Kim had not been having any luck lately, and a bead of sweat was running down his face. He dipped his hand into the bowl of chips and offered to play Go to the Mister, which greatly surprised him. The guy abruptly threw the chips on the table, from the sharp movement of which Mr. Kim shuddered and shrank in his chair. He was outraged by what the guy did, and Ken Bach, looking at the table, noted that it was not funny. Looking at the way the chips fell, Ken Bach concluded that signing the contract would bring great misfortune to the company, while if they fell the other way, they would mean little luck. Feeling that he might be in trouble, he stood up from the sofa and said that he would not be able to entertain Mr. Kim adequately and advised him to understand that they were living in the modern world and it was not worth demanding such a thing. Taking another look at the arrangement of the chips on the table and Mr. Kim, he declared that it was time for him to go. Mr. Kim became furious and waved his arms, splashing his drink, and began to curse at being treated so disrespectfully. He warned that there would be consequences for canceling Ken Bach's contract, but he didn't listen when he discovered that his nose was bleeding again. Ken Bach was born with some kind of divine energy. Since childhood, he felt spirits and the aura of other people, and when he saw bad spirits in people, he tried not to approach them. And he was always interested in whether his grandmother would scold him if he told her everything. His grandmother always told him not to even think about becoming a shaman because he received an amount of divine energy that the human body could not cope with. Touching his forehead, she explained that, in other words, he could become possessed by a god. She asked him not to talk and to live a normal life if he saw something strange again and felt bad. His grandmother was a shaman and always repeated these words to him when pain came to him, but he did not understand why he had to endure all this. Over time, he became accustomed to such manifestations of his incredible strength. But that day, his head was ready to explode. He could barely move his legs from such pain and unfortunately found himself in a crowded place far from home. It was a very sudden attack. Ken Bok was wincing in pain, unable to go on. But none of the passers-by paid any attention to him, since at that very moment an accident occurred on the road. Ken Bok, hearing the screams of people, opened his eyes with difficulty to see what was happening. There was a car on fire on the road that crashed into a truck. On the asphalt near the cars, Ken Bok noticed someone's necklace with a prayer for protection hanging on it. It was very familiar to him, since he had once made something very similar with his grandmother for all members of the family. But Ken Bok's parents died. It was a very difficult time for him, long and eventful, as it would be for any other person who lost their loved ones. Behind his back, they whispered about the drunk driver who was to blame for the accident and about how Ken Bok was now an orphan. He blamed himself for having realized that the failure was his fault and for not paying attention in time. He asked his parents for forgiveness for such a serious offense that cost them their lives. Suddenly, he felt a warm light on himself and soft, juicy grass under his feet. Everything around was strewn with snow-white flowers. He began to look around, not understanding where he found himself. The snow-white flowers were replaced by multicolored and bright ones, which were dotted across the equally bright grass. In the distance, he saw his father and mother, which surprised him very much. They walked further and further away from him, and he began to shout for them to wait for him too. They just smiled back at him and continued to move away. He rushed to run after them, begging them to take him with them. But someone stopped him, grabbed him by the shoulder, and asked where he was going. Ken Bok froze in fear. There was a young guy next to him who seemed to be floating in the air, and asked him if he wanted to cross over to the other side. Ken Bok was taken aback, but the guy extended his hand and assured him that he could fulfill any of his wishes. Ken Bok took his hand and confusedly asked if it was true and who this guy was. There was a bright flash of light where they shook hands, but it was neither blinding nor burning. The boy smiled. He replied that he was the law, he was a deity, and asked Ken Bok not to break the laws of heaven. Ken Bok's mouth opened silently in fear. His eyes were also shining, and he did not understand what he should do. The vision passed as quickly as it appeared, and in front of him, Ken Bok saw his grandmother, who was looking at him with concern. Grandma hugged him tightly, scolding him for trying to cross the 3 rivers of death. She explained to him that he had a fit and did not let go of him. From that day on, Ken Bok's power only grew. Although he had gotten used to it, the impact became much worse over time. It wasn't very fair. He had a power that he couldn't use because of its harm. After the seizure on the street, Ken Bok went to meet his friend at a restaurant. They were having dinner, and the friend asked about his dismissal after a year of hard work. When he received confirmation, he called it unfair that Ken Bok had not told his boss that the contract would bankrupt the company. Pouring himself a drink, Ken Bok replied that he would be considered crazy if he told everything and still could not achieve anything. Taking a sip, Ken Bok noted that his friend had apparently been fired as well, to which he emphasized that the company had never hesitated to do so. Ken Bok asked him to calm down, but he was already furious and, slamming his glass on the table, reminded him that 70% of that idiot's subscribers came thanks to him. He explained that he didn't even know how to play properly, and he helped him get by. He was upset that there was no one to trust, and there was only betrayal around. His name was Choi Byung-hun. He was 28 years old, a video editor and a longtime friend of Ken Bok. Ken Bok made fun of him about his subscriber percentage, and he grimaced and suggested that the percentage was probably lower. Ben-hun dismissed the conversation, and deciding that they had both lost their jobs, suggested streaming together and, smiling, jokingly asked Ken Bok to become his new cash cow. Ken Bok thought about it and admitted that he loved games, to which Byung-hun reminded him that he was invited to join a professional team in high school. Ken Bok began to remember how he once played and noted to himself that these seemed to be the best times in his life. He was silent for a moment, finishing his food and thinking about the offer. It was quite tempting, but it carried certain risks. Looking at Ben-hun, who was waiting for his answer with great hope in his eyes, he pointed out that his friend should remember the reason why he had to quit the games. Hiding in his hood, Ben-hun remembered that during the games, Ken Bok felt ill and apologized, considering it to be a stupid condition. After thinking for a moment, he turned to Ken Bok again and noted that he seemed to have never used the capsule. Ken Bok was a little stunned since he didn't really know what it was, but Ben-hun claimed that everyone was playing them now. He began to convince me that since he would be using his head and not his body, there should be no problems, since even people with physical disabilities play them calmly. Ken Bok thought about this access device that would immerse you in virtual reality. The spread of these devices was a turning point in the world of gaming, and many things changed because of them. Ken Bok propped his head up with his hand, thought for a bit more, and agreed to try it once, but he still had to earn money somehow. The next day, Ken Bok went to the computer club to try out a new way of playing games. Entering the capsule, Ken Bok began to doubt whether he was doing everything right. Ben Hun was a little nervous and decided to ask again whether his friend was sure of this decision. Ken Bok jokingly asked if this thing could kill him. His friend, closing the capsule, promised that he would monitor all the indicators and keep everything under his control. Ken Bok smiled and prepared to begin. He was curious about what might come of this. The capsule began its work, making a little noise. Ken Bok closed his eyes and was transported into another reality. For him, as a person with slightly different abilities, like others, this felt special. After some loading time, Ken Bok turned into a playable character. He saw a white space in front of him and gradually began to feel his body. He raised his hand up, surprised at how real everything looked. The body synchronization with the system was completed, and Ken Bok was amazed at what the default settings were for his body. The system offered to undergo training and a physical test. It seemed to him that these were difficult conditions for a basic check, but he assumed that they could have been specially hardened so as not to die immediately. The system gave a countdown and visualized Ken Bok in some ancient hall. Ken Bok braced himself for something really tough and crouched down at the start. Time passed, but nothing changed. The hall was quiet and calm, and no obstacles appeared. Ken Bok was surprised and stood up, folded his arms across his chest, asking himself if this was some kind of bug. Ben Hong, looking at the screen, saw his friend standing still and became worried about why he didn't run. He began to worry that he might get sick, so he slowed down. And finally, Ken Bok rushed forward, dodging arrow attacks and sharp blades falling from the ceiling. Ken Bok thought it was not bad for a first time and kept running. His friend, watching him, was shocked by what Ken Bok was doing in the game. He couldn't help but swear at Ken Bok's unexpected tricks. Ken Bok was very fast. He deftly dodged traps with various tricks. Ben Hun noted this. But the strange thing was that Ken Bok avoided all the randomly appearing traps and did not make a single mistake. Watching all his movements, it seemed as if he knew in advance where the trap would appear next and what kind of trap it would be. He sped up before the arrows and dashed in front of them in a second. He ducked, jumped, or slowed down just when it was needed. The test ended and the system announced the finish with colorful fireworks. Ken Bok slid across the floor, trying to stop. The system produced results that placed Lee Kyung Bok in third place in the overall ranking, which was equivalent to a true professional. Ben Hun couldn't believe his eyes. If Ken Bok hadn't stood still for the first 5 seconds, he would have been ranked first in the world based on what the game was giving out. Ben Hong was very amazed and noted how his assembly instinct screamed and rejoiced. He believed that his friend Ken Bok was definitely a genius and was guaranteed success. Ken Bok didn't yet know that his life would soon change and turn upside down. When Ken Bok's test started and nothing happened, he was initially very confused. He remained squatting and tried to figure out what was wrong. He thought it was a bug in the game system, since the obstacles did not appear in front of him. The most interesting thing was that he saw the traps that were placed around the hall, but he could not understand how they worked. He also realized that it was strange that he could see them. In theory, they should be invisible and appear suddenly. Deciding to take matters into his own hands, he prepared to run forward and try out his theory. 5 seconds into the test, Ken Bok ran forward. I know where the traps are located, and roughly guessing how they should work, he deftly avoided them all. At the same time, he also noticed that he easily controlled every part of his body, which certainly helped him a lot. He also felt that his power began to manifest itself, but for some reason he still did not feel the recoil as it usually happened. Noticing this, he decided to test himself to the fullest. Only in this way could he check that there would be no backlash from the sending of his unusual energy. He performed a trick to attack from both sides, a crack in the block, a flip in the air, and a handstand. He very quickly calculated the optimal path for his movement and bypassing all the traps that the game system put forward for him. Having chosen the best one, he rushed to run along it, jumping over obstacles. When he reached the goal he had set for himself, the system notified him of the end of the test, and everything around him began to sparkle with fireworks. Ken Bok stopped watching the changes in visualization and was very surprised that this was already the end of the training. He started rummaging through the settings on the hologram screen, wondering if he could exit the game and how to turn off the system in general. After studying the settings a bit, he found what he needed and switched off. The capsule doors opened. Ben Hong immediately jumped up to him, who was in the capsule and trying to recover from the state that was similar to after anesthesia. Ben Hong was amazed by his skills and immediately attacked him with questions about whether it was really his first time, and noting that he could easily take first place in the world. Trying to come to his senses, Ken Bok was surprised that there were wounds even in training, But Ben-hun no longer paid any attention to him and was afraid because he could not record it on video. He knew that such a video could get millions of views. He turned around and saw that Ken Bok was not feeling well and asked if he needed to be taken to the hospital. Ken Bok declined the offer, claiming that he was fine. Surprisingly, he felt no pain after using his power, and there was no recoil in the capsule. He felt incredible. It was now clear to him what it felt like to release all his power. He also noted to himself that in reality, the sensations were not so vivid. He laughed, causing Ben Hong to stare at him with a puzzled look. Ken Bok clenched his fist tightly and exclaimed how much fun it was. After the trial test, the boys decided that this should be enough for the first time and went home. Ben-hun assured that since Ken Bok had no pain, it meant that they had found something worth nitrate. Such talent would be a crime and asked his friend to think carefully. Waving goodbye, Ken Bok was a little embarrassed and pointed out that his friend, as always, was greatly exaggerating. On our way home, Ken Bok thought about what happened and Ben-hun's offer to do gaming streams the whole way. He was aware of the fact that in games his strength was demonstrated much more often. But because of this, the return was worse, and that is why in the past he gave up playing and gave up. But now he realized how different everything was in the capsule, and couldn't believe that he had found a way to bypass receiving the recoil. Suddenly a very strange sensation pierced him. He froze in the middle of the street as this feeling grew rapidly. His head began to hurt very badly. He bent over and groaned in pain. He had a very bad feeling about something, but he couldn't understand what might happen this time. At such moments, he unconsciously looked where something was about to happen. It was as if his body had stopped obeying him and something from above was controlling him. He stood at the top of the stairs and looked down to see that a little girl had slipped down the steps and was falling. Ken Bok immediately rushed forward, hoping to save her from serious injuries. He grabbed the railing and slid down and miraculously managed to catch the girl before she broke something. Her mother was shocked by what was happening and simply froze in place. But she would hardly have been able to help her, since she was holding the child in her arms for less time. She began to thank Ken Bok for saving her daughter, and he smiled awkwardly. I assure you that there was nothing wrong with that. But for the people around him, he was a real hero. Ken Bok smiled at the girl and her mother who were going about their business and waved his hand at them. And as soon as this situation ended, he again plunged into his thoughts. He thought that this time too he could avoid the backlash from using force. Well, something happened to him that happened constantly, and for which he should be prepared. His body was pierced by incredible pain. Unable to cope with it, he involuntarily bent over and sat down right in the middle of the sidewalk. He didn't understand why he still hadn't come to terms with it, even after going through all this. He addressed himself, asking him not to be mistaken anymore. This pain would be with him for the rest of his life. His grandmother said that he needed a healthy body and mind, and only then would he be able to cope with his power. Since he didn't really have a choice, he decided to at least start doing sports. For him, it was more like survival. While he was training, Ben-hun jumped up to him and immediately started cursing that he couldn't contact him. Ken Bok joked about him being a ghost, but he noted that it was impossible to sleep in such a situation. He shoved the phone in Ken Bok's face and asked him what he was doing again. Ken Bok was outraged by the number of questions and cursed at the fact that they wanted something incomprehensible from him. On his phone screen was a frame where Ken Bok saves a girl. Ken Bok was surprised that the recording from city cameras leaked onto the internet. Ben-hun noted that although the frame was very blurry, but still anyone could understand who exactly was in the frame, expressed his shock. Ken Bok joked that you noted that the face in the frame was not visible. But Ben-hun ignored this point and pointed out that the video had spread all over YouTube. Ken Bok was taken aback by the news that had come to him early in the morning. But he understood that it was due to the village that had always limited him. The video really took over the internet by force, and people thought he was a superhero and admired his precise movement without the slightest doubt. Ken Bok received the support of the people, and it was very pleasant for him. He had already completely forgotten what this feeling was like. Smiling, he turned to Ben-hun. He straightened up and said that he wanted to take a risk, and therefore he should be his accomplice. To which Ben-hun became agitated and noted that he understood how hard it was for his friend, but the crime was too much. Ken Bok, smiling at such a joke, decided to put everything on the last attempt and agreed to the previously received offer to make a good game stream. The next day they gathered together at Ken Bok's house. Ben-hun had brought a game capsule with him and was busy installing programs. Ken Bok didn't understand when he had managed to buy it, because it must have been very expensive. He wanted to send half the cost, which offended Ben-hun a little, but he decided to ignore it and asked what game they would start. After thinking for a while, Ken Bok replied that he had chosen something for beginners. The beginning of this game was related to the hospital. The weather in your game was disgustingly rainy at the beginning. They were pushing a gurney along the hospital corridor in panic and talking to each other. This game was called Biocrisis, a masterpiece known for its complexity in zombie apocalypse world. It was recently remade for virtual reality, so its fame returned. Ken Bach kept the basic settings in the game and indicated information about himself without even writing his name. Yesterday it started with the main character lying under a drip. He was unconscious for a long time and finally came to his senses. When Ken Bach woke up and sat up in bed, he discovered that he was in a hospital room and also that the immersion in this game was unrealistically clear. He immediately smelled blood, emphasizing that even this was added to the game. A user joined the broadcast of the game. Ken Bach, unhooking the IVs from himself, greeted him. A comment was added that Ken Bach was streaming for the first time. This surprised him a lot, because how could you guess that it was his first time in the capsule? He whispered the answers, and when asked why he spoke like that, he emphasized that the atmosphere was such that it was better not to make noise. Raising his head, he saw an icon above him indicating that there were no passages. But Ken Bach didn't respond to the rest of the comments, as his strange feeling returned and forced him to focus on the moment. It was a rather ominous premonition that came from the doors leading to the corridor from the ward. As expected, its power manifested itself. Sounds similar to gunshots were heard in the corridor, and he grabbed the IV stand and decided to check what was there. The comments continued, warning Ken Bach of the danger, but they were supplemented with seemingly no spoilers. Ken Bach hid behind the wall and listened. There was a policeman standing in the corridor, and it was as if he felt that someone was standing behind him and asking about it. He shot at the people who were advancing on him in a crowd, but as soon as he looked at them closely, it became clear that they were no longer people at all. Turning to Ken Bach, the policeman addressed them and ordered them to quickly run away from here. Ken Bach walked out into the corridor holding the same IV stand in his hands and looked at what was happening. Looking at the policeman, he decided that he was his ally and noted that it would be much easier to play with a gun. He decided to ask if he had an extra gun and move towards him, but first, he needed to deal with the zombie. While Ken Bach was running towards the fight, comments poured into the stream saying that the newbies' streams were great because they were always down. Everyone who watched the stream thought that Ken Bach would die right there, because no newcomer had ever managed to fight zombies so easily. But he boldly rushed with his droplet at the monsters, not doubting his decisions at all. Ben Hun watched his friend's performance on the screen with delight and ate cookies. He commented out loud that it didn't matter what a genius his friend was. The game only truly revealed itself after death. But what he saw next couldn't fit into his head. He adjusted his glasses and moved closer to the monitor to make sure he wasn't imagining things. He killed the zombies one by one and counted them. He used all the objects that came his way, right down to the pens that fell out of the pocket of one of the zombies. Even with the pen, he was able to defeat another seventh monster with such a calm expression on his face, as if he did this every day. Looking around, he calculated that there were 3 zombies left. He didn't see them, but his power gave him clues. One of the zombies suddenly ran up to him from behind and was about to tear him to shreds. At first, it turned out that Ken Bach did not see him, but he turned sharply and swung the IV hanger, and he tore apart the zombie's head, counting him as the 8th. He followed it up with another one, which he skewered as an appetizer, making it number 9 on his list. And there remained the last zombie, which Ken Bach grabbed with the help of the cross-shaped wheels of the stand. And having spun around in place with him and thrown him off somewhere into the distance, he counted him as the 10th. He did it with such force that when the zombie fell, it simply flew into pieces. Wiping his face from the waist of his opponents, Ken Bach thought that this was the end, but the premonition subsided. Meanwhile, dozens of comments were scattered in the comments under the stream. They did not believe that Ken Bach was a newbie. The system showed that Ken Bach completed the task of rescuing the policeman in 1 minute, in just 35 seconds. In the comments, people didn't even know that the policeman could have been saved. Ken Bach smiled and said that the training was easy, just like he thought. The comments exploded again with indignation and why he calls it easy, and praised the new gamer genius. After the hidden quest was completed and Ken Bach was happy about how easy it was, the policeman looked around. After which he called out to the patient, who was Ken Bach, and asked him to stand still as they needed to talk. When the policeman came closer, Ken Bach asked about his condition, to which he assured that everything was fine and began to rummage through his pockets, wanting to give him something. He handed him a card to access the police storage facility in the basement. In the comments, players were surprised that the events in Ken Bach's game were developing so quickly. The policeman explained that the way there was a bit confusing and promised to bring Ken Bach as close to him as possible, which further amazed those watching the game. Seeing the comments, Ken Bach realized that this was something unusual in this game and showed the card and invited everyone to follow him. While escorting Ken Bach to the basement, the policeman said that people suddenly began to lose consciousness and their bodies began to rise up, and thus complete chaos occurred all around. The policeman was walking ahead and suddenly stopped and swore. There was blood on the handkerchief he was holding in his hands, and it was also flowing from his mouth. He noted that apparently his time had come. Ken Bach froze and quickly examined the policeman, noticing a bite on his leg, and wondered to himself why the policeman hadn't said anything about it. The policeman handed Ken Bach a gun and asked him to take it. He explained that it had to be held with both hands and showed how to extend your arms to shoot. He stepped forward and, putting his hands up, suggested that they practice, explaining that they should not close their eyes and press the trigger. The policeman was already turning into a zombie. Well, and with his last strength, he explained to the guy that after the shot, he should go down to the emergency exit behind him. As Ken Bach took aim at the police officer, he thought that I would never have predicted that he would receive the gun that way. Without thinking twice, he shot the policeman, preventing him from becoming a monster. After standing for a moment and looking at the policeman's body, Ken Bach said out loud that he was very sorry. After this, Ken Bach left the corridor and went to the basement, as he had been told earlier. In the comments, they asked to be careful because this place looked very dangerous, and also asked to change the name and enable donations on the stream. Ken Bach asked for a minute to figure it out, noting that he was a newbie in all this, and only after changing all the settings did the first donation of 5,001 immediately arrive with a signature that the newbie was finished. The comments didn't believe that he didn't understand anything about it, but Ken Bach assured that he was speaking facts. After reading some more comments, Ken Bach began to go down to the basement so as not to waste time. Meanwhile, his friend Ben Hun recorded short videos and edited them immediately. He also made a clip, pay attention to the fact that he is a newbie in the game, and covered the hidden path. He was delighted. He decided that since they were doing this, they had to make Ken Bach famous. He posted these clips to a streaming community that was typically accessed on phones, where a short action video was enough to get attention. Ben Hun joined the game's community and uploaded a full walkthrough of the hidden path. He happily spun around in his chair. They say that Ken Bach should be grateful to have such a partner. Almost immediately, his phone started ringing off the hook with notifications. He unlocked the phone with irritation, thinking it was some kind of spam. The video he had just uploaded had received a lot of comments and likes. He was shocked at how his friend was becoming popular so quickly. But this only made him more excited to create more videos because everything was going as it should. He noted the saying that the world never leaves a genius alone, watching the number of likes and comments under the clip increase. Ken Bach, meanwhile, having reached a certain place, stopped and looked confused. Further on, the stairs were blocked, and he had to go through the first floor. While he was looking for a way, more and more people were joining his broadcast. A notification appeared in front of him that more than 100 viewers had already watched it. This made him even more confused. He was amazed that so many people had started watching it in such a short time and greeted everyone. And then Ken Bach began to guess that the place in the ranking was not just a coincidence. And after that, he received a donation of 10,001 with a question whether he takes missions. Ken Bach announced that he had never done this before and was ready to take it. A task appeared on the screen to get to the basement without taking damage with a reward of 1,000,001. After seeing this task, Ken Bach understood what Ben Hun meant when he talked about things that streamers should be wary of. He said that the most dangerous were the trolls. These were viewers who challenged newcomers and gave them a task with a big reward and thus drew the newcomer into it. It was important that no one would watch a boring mission, so the difficulty was greatly increased. And then Ben Hun clapped his hands, noting that this was exactly how new streamers disgraced themselves. If a newbie fell into a trap, it could get to the point where they had to quit streaming. Then Ken Bach emphasized that in such a case, it was enough to simply complete the task. But Ben Hun smiled because everything was not as simple as it seemed, because there were a ton of new streamers. Ken Bach looked at the hologram with the task and wondered if it was so difficult. The comments tried to dissuade him, knowing what usually followed. But Ken Bach accepted the task and smiled and promised to amuse everyone. There was an uproar in the comments. Everyone thought it was a mistake. A notification immediately appeared that the chat would be disabled for the duration of the mission. Ken Bach was surprised to see this and asked the audience to be patient for a little while. He opened the doors, and entering the hall saw a mountain of dead zombies in the center. There were signs of a struggle, scratches on the doors and walls as well as blood spatter. Ken Bok looked around and, taking the pistol more firmly, walked towards the elevator. Suddenly, one zombie's hand rose up. Ken Bok jumped up and held his pistol out in front of him. The entire mountain of corpses rose to its feet and was ready to tear Ken Bok apart. Then it became clear to him what the difficulty of the mission was. He raised the gun up and fired, suggesting to finish it quickly. The chat could not understand why he did this. Ken Bok quickly reloaded his pistol's magazine, while the zombies were still some distance away. He stretched his arms forward and began to aim at the monsters that were staggering as they walked. After waiting a bit, he fired. One bullet after another flew out of the shower of his pistol. Ken Bok aimed straight at the zombie's head, because that was the only way to kill them forever, and he hit the target accurately. He didn't stop and continued shooting, destroying all the monsters in the hall. He took a good position and did everything very quickly, not letting any of the zombies get close to him. And after a very short time, Ken Bok fired the last bullet into the zombie's head. He quickly interrupted everyone in the room. The comments flared up with renewed vigor. Everyone was surprised how the newcomer could be so fast. Ken Bok leaned against one of the tables and relaxed. Without even looking, he slowly pulled the gun to the side and fired. The bullet hit the last zombie, who appeared out of nowhere. The system gave an achievement for 10 headshots in a row. Ken Bok asked with boredom in his voice if this was all that was prepared for him. The audience wrote where he had been hiding himself and his talent all this time. After that, many donations poured in, from 1,000 to 10,000 one at a time, but Ken Bok was focused. His premonition worked again. He looked around the room and realized that something was coming straight at him. He felt chaotic and rapid movements, but he could not see anyone yet. Very suddenly, dogs, who were also zombies, jumped through the window, breaking the glass into the hall. Ken Bok noted that this was not the same as before. The dogs' lower jaws were split in two and diverged to the sides, and their tongues were certainly several times longer than those of ordinary dogs. In the comments, they said that these were the famous zombie dogs. They tried to figure out how to hit them with a gun, and someone said that they always lost at this point. Ken Bok certainly didn't expect to see these creatures, and was a little embarrassed when they flew into the room. Without thinking twice, he started running away from them. He quickly ran to the side and jumped incredibly high into the air, and the dogs ran in circles trying to catch up with him. Ken Bok jumped and fired towards the dogs. The chat was again in an uproar because it was unclear how anyone could aim in such a situation. The most amazing thing was that Ken Bok shot straight into the dog's head in the center of the forehead. Landing on the floor, he fired another shot. The last bullet fired again hit its intended target exactly. Ken Bok landed on his feet and tried to keep his balance. Someone wrote that he was definitely a monster to do such things. Ken Bok ruffled his hair in embarrassment and glanced towards the now completely dead dogs. He sat down next to them and looked at them sadly, saying that he loved animals very much, and it was very unpleasant to kill them. Again, without looking, Ken Bok shot off to the side and killed another zombie with a short laugh. Comments poured in, laughing at the very difficult mission. Ken Bok smiled smugly and stood up, blowing dust off his pistol, after which he approached the elevator and, pushing the doors open, announced that he was going to go down to the basement along the cable that held the elevator cabin itself. Commenters wondered why Ken Bok hadn't jumped into the shaft, explaining that they had seen others do it. When he came down, he saw a flashlight on the floor. Without thinking twice, he picked it up and began to look around. He was on guard and kept his pistol at the ready, but none of the enemies appeared. After looking around for a bit, Ken Bok finally found the doors leading to the police vault and declared that the mission must have been completed. The chat was once again available for viewing, and immediately a notification appeared about a donation of 1,000,000 won in mockery of Agent Q, who was now disgraced and apparently bankrupt. Ken Bok shone a flashlight on his face and thanked everyone for the donation and help to the newcomer. He laughed and noted that he would be waiting for new interesting missions. In the chat, they were shouting for him to get it faster, since he apparently wasn't afraid of anything. After waiting a bit, Ken Bok asked if there would be new missions, and a few seconds later received a donation from Agent Q of 10,000 won and a signature that missions would be coming soon. Ken Bok laughed and promised he would wait. He took out of his pocket the card that the policeman had given him and offered to finally open these doors. He placed the card on the sensor and the door unlocked. But the atmosphere around was too tense and Ken Bok felt something was wrong. Behind the door, his special sense detected something ominous that made him hold his breath and slow down. The door locked again. He shone the flashlight into the darkness, trying to see something in it. The chat noted that the door had closed again and asked if it was possible to just walk through it. Kenbach switched to a whisper and asked the audience if he understood correctly that it would have been better not to make noise, and smiled with interest. He shone his light ahead and saw a regiment of decaying zombies and noted that the design was disgusting. The chat room began to buzz again. The system notified that a zombie swarm had been detected. It consisted of exactly 10 zombies that were one. The chat noted that it was a boss, and usually he had to be killed at the exit from the hospital. At this time, Kenbach noticed that the boss did not see him, but only reacted to the sound. He thought that if he tried to enter, the sound notification would start again, and the monster would start attacking. He decided that this zombie needed to be somehow lured and distracted. He squeezed the entry card between his teeth and aimed his pistol somewhere upward. Kenbach then fired a shot, and the bullet tore the rope under the ceiling that held the lamp. The monster immediately reacted to the sound, and this gave Kenbach the opportunity to jump to another place practically under his nose. He took aim again and fired in the same direction. With the second shot, he tore apart the second channel on which the lamp was hanging, and it began to fall. The zombie was thrown from side to side by every shot, and that was what Kenbach wanted to achieve. While the zombie was trying to figure out who to attack, Kenbach jumped up to the door and, using his card, unlocked the doors. He left that room, noting that he had finally gotten where he needed to go, even though it was hard. In the chat, he was jokingly called the Master of Acceleration. As soon as he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut and locked again, but now Kenbach was even glad to hear this notification. He had no more bullets, and the first thing he needed to do was find a new weapon. Having illuminated the room, he was surprised and thoughtful. Initially, he thought that he would end up in some kind of storage room, but the room looked more like a large locker room, where even the emergency lighting was working. He was advised to check everything carefully, but when he went forward, he noted that it was empty, and it looked like someone had stolen all the useful things. Going even further, he discovered one closed cabinet, which immediately attracted all his attention. When he opened the cabinet, joyful comments about the find poured in. The locker seemed to belong to one of the police officers, and it contained a uniform and, of course, a weapon. He thought that he could change his clothes. Ignoring warnings that it might be a trap, Kenbach reached for the uniform. His clothes changed to a police uniform on which everything was conveniently located, and 2 pistols, 3 magazines, and another flashlight appeared. They wrote in the chat that Kenbach needed a lot of subscribers because the immersion into the game world was unrealistic, and they noted his strength. At this point, Agent Q sent out a new mission proposal, the condition of which was to not use firearms and defeat the zombie swarm for a reward of 1.5 million won. After receiving a new mission in the chat, everyone started laughing and making various jokes. Immediately, some noise was heard from the side, and Kenbach suddenly turned in that direction. A swarm of zombies appeared around him, although he had previously locked it in another room. In the chat, they wrote that this boss is hard to beat even with a normal weapon, and if you run out of ammo, it was worth starting over again. Kenbach wondered what he could use as a weapon, and his gaze fell on the policeman's baton attached to his uniform. He immediately unfastened it and grabbed it in his hand, preparing for battle. He told the audience that they were offering him the chance to defeat this thing in close combat. Kenbach looked like an ant against the swarm of zombies. The zombie was huge. He slid across the floor, bouncing to the side. As he approached the zombie and looked for a good position to attack, he turned to Agent Q. He jumped up and hit the zombie with one of its many arms that were also legs. He joked about the zombie being long-legged, which was also the meaning of his donor's last name. And when he saw the comment on this matter, he chuckled, thinking he hadn't said it out loud. The zombie began to actively attack Kenbach, and it was difficult to understand which of his mouths he would start trying to tear him apart with. Looking at the chat again, Kenbach noted that this time the mission given to him was really interesting. The chat was disconnected according to the rules of taking the mission. Kenbach prepared to go on the offensive, saying that one way or another, this boss was still a zombie and could be killed. He rushed into battle, noting that it was enough to just smash the monster's head in. The comments were surprised that he agreed to the mission without knowing the conditions of victory. In the chat, it was written that Kenbach would not be able to find the main body of the zombie swarm in close combat, and therefore the mission was almost impossible to complete. In the first minutes, Kenbach still coped quite well, dodging the boss's attacks. But he also delivered his blows by jumping as high as possible and hitting the zombie in one of the heads. He acted very quickly to prevent his opponent from having time to strike back. It was very interesting to watch this, as everyone was waiting with trepidation to see how it might end. Kenbach climbed over the zombies like they were a rock, seemingly oblivious to their extreme danger. In one of his next jumps, he hit several of the monster's heads at once and didn't receive a single scratch, although he didn't get rid of them completely. Watching Ken Bok wriggle around the boss, the chat wrote that he had no chance of defeating him in close combat, since only one of the 12 heads was correct. Leaping high above the swarm of zombies, Ken Bok discovered one head that was different from the others. He had a split second to examine all the monsters' heads and determine exactly which one needed to be broken. In this, he was again helped by his unusual strength, which seemed to suggest the right choice. And having found the right one, which he looked at for the first time, he took aim. He regrouped as he dived down to deal damage exactly where it was needed and thrust the club full length into the zombie. From the strong blow, the head seemed to burst and its parts flew in different directions. The rest of the body also began to disintegrate. The tongues and tentacles fell to the floor, and the eyes of the remaining heads began to fade. The system issued a notification that the task had been completed successfully. Ken Bok jumped to the floor near the fallen zombie and tried to catch his breath. After the notification, he began to slowly rise and carefully examine the monster. His face was stained with blood and other zombie fluids, and he grimaced in disgust. Looking down at himself, he saw that his hands and uniform were also dirty with zombie waste. It was very disgusting and also offensive for the new clothes, and he tried to hold back the nausea. A donation with a reward arrived and a chat opened, where everyone admired the skills and the fullness of Ken Bok. Ken Bok was silent for a moment, trying to catch his breath and recover from the occasional urge. And then he smiled as if nothing had happened and thanked Agent Q, expressing that with him the stream became much more interesting. The chat started to joke about the agent, but he sent another small donation with the admission that the newbie really deserved the victory. Ken Bok decided to go upstairs and figure out what to do next. After leaving the room, he discovered that he had managed to get around the blocked staircase from the other side, and from there, he could exit into the first-floor lobby. Looking around, he found traces of a zombie swarm, and noted that he would have had to meet it anyway before escaping from the hospital. As he stepped outside the threshold, his eyes lit up with delight. He began to descend the low steps and noted that he saw incredible beauty. He went out into the city and even smiled at the view that opened up before him. The world of the zombie apocalypse appeared before him, and everything was conveyed incredibly colorfully by the developers. The first section of the game was over and the stream ended. Ken Bok left the capsule and he and Byung-hun began to discuss the game. Ben-hun emphasized that he was talking about the resulting hit and said that there were more than 200 viewers on the stream. He then showed Ken Bok the community from the platform he was streaming on and pointed out that he was on the top 5 main page. Ken Bok expressed that now it became clear to him where only the viewers came from, to which Ben-hun replied that he had not been playing with toys all this time, but working. Ben-hong handed the phone to Ken Bok and pointed out that this was what impressed him most. Ken Boka was mentioned by the game developer, who noted the good and high-quality walkthrough of his game. Ken Bok was very surprised that this article was really about him, and noted that it would be worth changing his game nickname. Ben-hun immediately supported this idea. He announced that he had already prepared a list of candidates for his nickname and offered to choose from it. Ken Bok rolled his eyes when he saw the presentation design and jokingly asked if he was really an assembler. But still, Ken Bok was interested in something, and he asked to return the previous slide. After looking at it again, he smiled and said that this one should be perfect, and he would take it. The next time he started the stream, he was much more confident. Now Ken Bok played under the name P Purple and introduced himself and greeted everyone. He thanked everyone who came to his stream and emphasized that the chat was flying so fast that he did not have time to read every message and asked for understanding. In response to the comments that came in, he noted that everyone could notice that last time he played without a name, and today he would like to officially greet everyone. He greeted everyone again and introduced his game name, and many viewers liked him. He explained that the name has an ideal game, so they will try not to make mistakes. The chat approved this decision. He pointed his finger at the game's start button, not wanting to chat about anything for long. The system notified that there were 10 seconds left before the game started, and all visualizations disappeared. Ken Bok tried to get into his role as a famous streamer and suggested that they start the game. The image began to change. The game started and he found himself near the hospital where he ended up last time. Ken Bok noted that he didn't notice last time, since he immediately finished the stream, that the street felt different. Immediately, a zombie appeared behind him and rushed up the steps straight towards him. Without turning around, Ken Bok grabbed his hand and pulled him towards himself. after which Ken Bok threw him over himself and knocked him to the floor, but did not let go and continued to hold him while he took out his pistol. He aimed at the monster's head and pulled the trigger without much hesitation. A shot rang out and the zombie's head flew around the area. Still holding his foot on the zombie, he turned to someone, drawing attention to the fact that the person was definitely alive and not a zombie. He carefully turned back, asking who it was. There was a girl standing behind him, pointing her gun at him. There was some indignation in the chat that Sandra was supposed to save him, but he threw the zombie over his shoulder, and everything turned out to be unatmospheric. The girl looked Ken Boku straight in the eye and whispered that she knew the entire local police force was dead, hinting at the stolen uniform. Sandra kept her sights on Ken Bok and asked his name. Other viewers, on the contrary, appreciated the changes in the plot, noting that it was cool. Ken Bok introduced himself by his game name Purple. The girl nodded and gave her name, after which she asked whether he had been wounded and whether the zombies had bitten him without putting the gun away. Purple raised his hands and offered the girl to examine him herself if she didn't trust him. The girl smiled and lowered her weapon, which surprised the audience, because usually in the game she was strict and had a disdainful look. Sandra spoke about the camp with the other survivors and noted that Purple's power would definitely be useful to them. She extended her hand to him, which left Ken Bok a little confused. She offered to join them, to which he made a fuss again, because this was another hidden path and usually everything was not so easy. Sandra asked again, looking into Ken Boku's eyes, if he wanted to go with him, and continued to reach out her hand to him. Ken Bok was trying to figure out how his decision would affect the game. The game system confirmed whether he wanted to accept Sandra's offer and offered two possible responses. After thinking for a while, Ken Bok decided to agree and chose the necessary confirmation. He spoke a line that meant agreement to go with her, and the system automatically recognized the choice. Sandra smiled and noted that she was glad to hear this, because even one person was very important and called him to follow her. Suddenly, there was an unpleasant sound. The girl turned around in fear and told Ken Bok to hide because they had returned. The sound of boots clanking echoed across the asphalt. About a dozen people dressed in protective suits and gas masks poured out of the military vehicle. They searched for survivors and checked the area. One of them kicked the zombie corpse, cursing them, while the other hurried him as they needed survivors for test samples. Ken Bok and Sandra hid between the cars. The girl exhaled and whispered that they were close to danger. Ken Bok asked who these people were. Sandra pointed out to Ken Bok the emblem on each of these men's shoulders. They were Mercenary farm mercenaries. Ken Bok showed surprise, to which Sandra emphasized that they were not looking for survivors for experiments and that it was obvious that they were connected to this incident. The girl also wondered why they were not seen, but still the mercenaries came to this very place. The mercenaries began to climb into their car, and it was audible that they were going to move to the next block. Sandra turned to Ken Bok, saying that they better return to the camp and warn everyone there. Ken Bok ran after her. The chat continued to be surprised at how easily the newcomer moved along the plot, because almost no one had seen such a branch, when Sandra helped and invited to the camp without problems. Soon they reached the camp, where they were very worried about Sandra and immediately rushed at her with various questions. The girl was surrounded because it was in the bottom that they were waiting for her. Sandra assured that everything was fine with her and noted that she brought the medicine that was missing. People noticed Ken Bok and asked who he was, noting that they didn't think there were still any police officers alive outside. Sandra promised to tell him everything later and asked where Logan was and was advised to go to his room. Ken Bok went with her. She knocked on the door and gave her name, after which she was invited in. Sandra carefully opened the doors, through which bright sunlight immediately began to shine. Logan was also a police officer and greeted the girl with hugs, noting that he was very glad that the girl remained safe. Sandra asked if anything had happened in her absence, to which Logan assured her that everything was absolutely fine and put his arm around her shoulder. Sandra smiled and noted that before the discussion she would like to introduce someone, and pointed her hand at Ken Bok and asked him to meet her. Ken Bok and Logan looked at each other and both of them enjoyed this meeting. Sandra, still smiling, pointed out that Logan was most likely mistaken when he said that there were no more police officers left. Ken Bok's gaze focused on him as if he sensed something was wrong. His instincts told him that Logan was not on the light side and he couldn't even figure out what he was supposed to do with this character. Logan walked up to him with a smile, noting how happy he was about this fact and the fact that Ken Bok looked quite familiar. Logan said that he thought he had seen Ken Bok earlier and put his hand on his shoulder. Ken Bok, looking at this gesture, was not very happy because he felt that Logan was being very hypocritical. Ken Bok knew for a long time that he was not the police officer he claimed to be. The game system immediately asked whether Ken Bok wanted to immediately reveal Logan's identity. Looking at the answer options, Ken Bach wondered whether it was possible to choose an option that did not follow the existing path. Ken Bach leaned over and began examining Logan's officer's badge and said that something was bothering him. Logan didn't like it at all and began to complain. Ken Bach indicated that Logan's police badge was the most disturbing thing, and the system offered to point out the differences between the two badges. Ken Bach smiled and noted that his badge was very different from Logan's, and the system recognized this answer as a clue and gave a hint to check the list of criminals that was in his pocket. Ken Bach said that with Andre, it was worth seeing it with your own eyes, and not just taking her word for it, and handed her a piece of paper. The order described Logan Meyer as a wanted man with 8 felony convictions for fraud. Logan immediately began to fuss and tried to find some kind of excuse for Sandra. And going to the table, he tried to feel the pistol lying on it. As soon as he picked it up, Ken Bach appeared right next to him and warned him that he shouldn't have done anything like that. But Sandra had her own views on this and immediately rushed towards them screaming. She called him a bastard and kicked him in the chest, knocking him to the floor. Ken Bach didn't interfere with this part of the game's plot and simply stood there smiling and watching as Sandra beat up this liar. The girl did not spare him and dealt blow after blow, not giving him a second to breathe. She didn't stop and grabbed him by the collar so tightly that he couldn't get away. The girl began to hit Logan in the face from different sides, sparing no effort in doing so. One of the last blows was so strong that Logan flew back and knocked down the front door, flying out into the hallway. Sandra was incredibly angry and slowly approached him, calling him various offensive names, asking how he could do this to everyone, and whether he would like her to hang him with her own hands. She pounced on him again, noting that she now understood why his eyes had immediately started darting around. Ken Bach smiled and noted to the chat that Sandra was apparently not to be trifled with. The chat emphasized that the girl had a certain image in response to this. Logan was beaten and no longer tried to justify himself because they wouldn't believe him anyway. He was tied with strong ropes. Sandra stood next to him asking how he dared to deceive the whole camp. She recalled how he kept saying that they were trying to contact the rescue team, but he himself turned them into a camp, into his kingdom, and dragged him across the floor towards the exit from the camp. In the chat, they suggested that he might not have done this for the first time. Initially, he said that since he was the last policeman, he had the only working radio that would help everyone get down. Sandra put him on the very edge of the roof and said that it was because of him that the entire camp was isolated. Ken Bach watched the public execution and read the comments that argued whether Ken Bach had done the right thing. Sandra, without waiting for an answer from Logan, threw him off the roof, not doubting her decision in the least. Logan fell below with no chance of survival. Sandra waved at him and wished him to become tasty dog food. Down below, dozens of zombie dogs were waiting for Logan, and they were very happy about this dinner. By evening, everyone had calmed down and sorted themselves out in their rooms. Ken Bach and Sandra went up to the room that until recently belonged to Logan. Ken Bach stood by the window and looked at Sandra, waiting for the situation to develop in some direction. Ken Bach asked Sandra what her next plans were. She herself noted that Ken Bach was also an officer, and now she didn't know what to do. She remembered how Logan promised that they would be able to save her, and she made a choice in his favor since he introduced himself as a policeman. Staying where they were was dangerous, given the possibility of Regenry Farm appearing. But she understood that she would have to take full responsibility for the surviving people, and besides, they really trusted her. She decided that you should leave the city on your own to protect yourself from mercenaries and zombies. She said she had planned to find a safe place and wait for a signal on the police radio, but she had made a mistake, and now the situation was dire. Ken Bach addressed the audience and noted that this was a game story, and Sandra, as it seemed to him, was an important character, and he thought it would be better to treat her more gently. He walked up to her and called out. Leaning over, he promised her that he would definitely help fix everything. The girl became embarrassed and, having thanked them, shared her thoughts that they would most likely not be in danger if they did not immediately decide where to go. She went to the table and started sorting through the papers. She said that the best option would be to ask the military for help. They would do something if they found out about survivors. When Ken Bach asked how to do this, she emphasized that there was no connection and that she would have to go personally to the outlet zone, and said that after the outbreak of zombies, this was the first and last safe zone. Ken Bach, looking at the map of the area, suggested going through the subway tunnel, suggesting that there were fewer risks there. Sandra appreciated this choice and noted that he was smarter than he seemed at first glance. Ken Bach began to think about how best to leave the camp, and at that moment Sandra glanced sideways at him and fell silent. Her lips began to tremble and she tried to press them tighter to keep from crying. She pressed herself against Ken Bok and thanked him, saying it really meant a lot that he was there for her. He put his arm around her and spoke excitedly, but she continued talking about her own. Sandra took a step back from him and, expressing hope that their feelings were mutual, gently pushed Ken Bok back. Ken Bok tried to stop her and smiled awkwardly. The chat exploded in anticipation of what could happen now. He was surprised that this part of the plot was so sudden and doubted whether it was part of the story at all. Sandra came close to him and he had nowhere to go. She pushed him onto the bed and lay on top of him and immediately kissed him hard. He tried to break away from her, but he couldn't move and asked the audience if this was normal. Ken Bok put his hand on the bed, still trying to break free from the girl's embrace, but not as actively. The viewers of the stream were shocked by this turn of events. Ken Bok looked horrified and asked very awkwardly if it was a sex scene. The night passed in a very unexpected development of the gameplay. He woke up to the bright sunlight that flooded the entire room. He rose slightly in bed and noted that he had thought for a long time about whether to do this, but was still glad that everything happened in the dark. Having quickly read the chat, he didn't even have time to come to his senses before Sandra noted that he had finally woken up. She sat on a chair in a robe, drinking coffee and reading something like a newspaper. And taking a sip of coffee, she expressed how cute Ken Bok was when he was sleeping. She lowered her legs to the floor and announced that she would go get ready to go out. Approaching the door, she indicated the meeting place in the hall. In the chat, people started writing how beautiful she was and that they came to the stream just for this. Ken Bok got dressed and lay down on the bed, looking through the comments, where they asked how long he was going to play this way, and that he noted that he was going down a hidden path and that it turned out that way. He was informed that he had missed 90% of the loot farming and asked if they wanted to go hunting before continuing on with the story. At that moment, the doors to the room opened slightly and a little boy looked out from behind them, holding a teddy bear in his hands, and said hello. Ken Bok got out of bed and turned to the baby and asked what happened. The boy extended his hand towards him, holding something in it, and noted that it was intended for him. Ken Bok what he brought and put out his palm for the boy to give him the thing. A gold coin fell from his palm. The boy pointed out that he did not know the owner, so the lost item had to be taken to the police. Ken Bok praised the boy for this correct action. Hugging the boy, Ken Bok lifted the coin up, examining it in more detail. Ken Bok decided that it was a lottery coin and was surprised. The chat laughed at him. If he hadn't caught Logan and taken the task from him, he would have known what it was for. Ben Hun, watching the game on the screen, freaked out when he heard that Ken Bok would be playing the slot machines. He didn't understand why the slot machine was there at all. The random box machine was a slot-type gacha that appeared early on. The game was difficult, so the chances of winning were terrible. Ben Hun remembered how he once tried to spin 30 times. It was a nightmare. Only healing potions dropped out. But the streamer was able to get millions of views from this. One of the streamers got really angry during the broadcast and threw his keyboard aside. He screamed that the slot machine was simply mocking him and not letting him get a normal win. There were about 50 streamers in the gambling community, and among them, Anatomy became a legend, and he received a golden shotgun after 39,000 attempts with some change. Ben Hong thought that this lottery was ridiculous and just a waste of time. But it was interesting to see what would happen if Ken Bok played this lottery. Ken Bok walked up to the machine with great confidence and twirled the coin between his fingers. Before giving it to the machine, he threw it high into the air. And having caught it, he asked the audience again whether the golden shotgun was the best weapon. He put a coin into the slot machine and waited for the result. He stood near the machine gun thinking about something and did not notice that the name for the weapon was very good. When he put a coin into the machine, the chat noted that he was crazy if he thought he could pull out such a weapon on the first try. The machine sounded a notification that you need to pull the lever on the right to stop the slots. After reading the comments again, Ken Bok said that he was going to pull him out first. I wondered if this would make the game too easy. He was very happy, which confused the chat a little. I don't think for a long time he pulled the lever to stop the slots, but as soon as he touched the handle of the lever, he was pierced by a very strange sensation that did not allow him to immediately move the lever from its place. It was the same feeling of power that he periodically felt before some important events that he could not have guessed otherwise. Everything before his eyes seemed to light up and become enveloped in a golden haze. At what moment did he freeze, holding the handle of the lever? For him, the feeling was definitely a little different this time, which seemed strange. He noted that he seemed to become more sensitive, especially his fingers, but nevertheless the feelings were constantly changing. I compared these different feelings to soft silk, to a burning sensation like a cat scratch, and to pain, like skin peeling off. He also noticed that these feelings depended on the rotation of the machine, and he closed his eyes tightly, concentrating on these sensations. In the chat, they wrote that he would definitely get a healing potion, while others were sure that he would definitely surprise everyone. He surrendered himself completely to his feelings, allowing some higher powers to guide his actions. He decided that he would pull the lever then he would feel the most pleasant sensation. He pulled the lever and began to watch as the matchmakers in the machine began to slow down. 3 cubes with question marks appeared on the screen, and a notification came that the prize was ready. Everyone froze in anticipation of what the reward would be. A very colorful and bright animation appeared on the screen, which was immediately noted in the chat. The prize was the same golden shotgun, which was the main prize of this game. The audience could not believe it. He still managed to win it on the first try. The game system also gave notifications that Ken Bach received a legendary item that had recoil reduction and semi-automatic fire. The ammo type will not be changed. Ken Bach noted that the shotgun was much better, which is why he imagined it, and suggested watching him go to the subway and have fun there. Sandra was already waiting for him at the threshold of the hall, and they immediately went into the underground metro tunnel. On their way, they met several monsters. One of them was a huge spider with dozens of her larvae that were ready to tear apart everyone they met. Every time I meet one of the monsters, they had no choice but to fight. With a partner like Sandra, the fights were much more fun and definitely easier. She was proficient with ranged weapons, as well as knives, which she used to easily deal with spider monsters. During the fight, she would sometimes throw her knife to Ken Boku when he needed it. Ken Bach, with incredible dexterity, caught it right on the run and used it for its intended purpose. How did they defeat the huge spider and her children, who had grown to be far from childish in size? It wasn't that difficult and took very little time, even though their opponents were quite fast. Well, they didn't need a golden shotgun with the spider, and Ken Bach dealt with a regular pistol that he found in a policeman's locker back in the hospital. With Sandra's support, everything was really very simple, and Ken Bach's own agility and strength were also important. After the victory, the game system gave a notification that the task was completed and the Arachne was defeated. In the chat, they wrote that soon, everyone would start rooting for the bosses since they were quite a pity. After defeating the spider, they moved further down the tunnel, but were quite careful. Seeing the sunlight and realizing that they had not left the tunnel, Ken Bach looked around and noted that they were in place. In the chat, they wrote that they expected a game of crazy difficulty. Everything looked very easy. Sandra and Kyung Bak were at the walls of the outlet military camp. After examining the security zone from the outside, Ken Bak was surprised, noting that this zone was supposed to be guarded by the military. Instead of the military, they saw people from the Region Farm mercenaries who swarmed throughout the area. The second section of the game, called The Survivors, was over as soon as they left the tunnel into the subway. As soon as Ken Bak finished broadcasting and started to exit the capsule, Byung-hun immediately shouted that they had to urgently upload all the content right now. Ken Bak was a little taken aback and asked not to scare him like that, watching this with his friends screaming either from delight or from something else. Ken Bak got himself a drink while Ben-hun said that he had to run like a madman. Ken Bak was very surprised that Ben-hun had already uploaded all the clips, to which he noted that it was necessary to strike while the iron was hot, and that opportunities could not be missed. He explained that of course there are a lot of viewers of the streams, but the clips were watched more often, and Ken Bak was the first to find the hidden path. But someone else could have recorded and posted the walkthrough on YouTube, and that would have been a serious loss. Ken Bak agreed, noting that he now realized that being ranked first was quite an impressive achievement. Ben-hun immediately suggested opening a YouTube channel, which almost made Ken Bak choke on his water. The clips posted online quickly gained a large number of views. New topics were opened on the forums to discuss the new streamer Purple, who has already become a favorite of many. There were also comments of indignation regarding various topics related to the game and a lot of controversy. The news that the new streamer had started a YouTube channel quickly spread among the viewers of the stream, and this made everyone happy. Sometimes internet users even outpaced the light, and the YouTube channel was instantly filled with people. And the most popular video was Sandra's cutscene. Rumors spread and comments were filled with foreigners. The most popular video among foreigners was the receipt of a golden shotgun. Famous streamer Anatomy commented on the video, and this brought even more popularity, and rumors continued to grow. On YouTube, the channel has already collected more than 100,000 subscribers, and everyone was surprised by such a rapid growth in popularity of the newcomer, and such a storm began to get out of control. Ken Bak was still in shock there, that he had become quite popular and moreover, was now receiving even more donations. He always thanked everyone for donations and for the fact that without the support of the viewers, nothing would have happened, and noted that he still did not believe that there were so many of them. On one of the trimos, he announced that he had one ad and smiled broadly. He stated that today a bot will be activated to manage the chat, and although freedom of speech is good, he wanted to prevent some problems that could happen. According to the rules, users had 3 complaints, and on the 4th they should have been banned. Ken Bok asked everyone to keep this in mind, and after that he suggested to continue playing the game. The system stopped loading the game and transferring him to the game world. He found himself back near the metro exit, watching dozens of mercenaries from Regenry Farm. Ken Bok and Sandra hid, trying not to be seen by any of the mercenaries because that would mean the end. Ken Bok noted that Regenry Farm seemed to be deceiving the government. You asked if there was another way. Sandra hid her face in her hand from the question. Sandra looked out from around the corner and suggested going forward, as soon as it became clear what was happening. Ken Bok whispered that they would have to go through them, and Sandra noted that the guns were not working. She explained that if they made too much noise, she would find herself in trouble and stressed that she would deal with them quickly and quietly with a knife. She tracked down 2 mercenaries who had come close enough to their hideout. Right in front of them, she threw in an old tin drink can to get their attention. They also shouted that the territory was under the jurisdiction of the 5th Detachment, and unauthorized entry was prohibited, and aimed their machine guns in the direction from which the can had flown. They ordered them to show up immediately, but before they could say they would open fire, Alexandra flew out of hiding and quickly dealt with them. First, she grabbed one of them and dragged him into hiding. And then she came back for another one and sat it down next to the first one. She proudly declared that the difficulties went away one by one, wiping her knives. Without thinking twice, she went to 3 more mercenaries who were also nearby and saw what she did to their partners. One of them immediately tried to report what was happening over the radio. But he didn't have time to contact anyone, as Sandra attacked him first. She quickly scattered them to the side, flying past like a storm. She didn't kill anyone. She took one of them hostage and asked him to be quiet. The mercenary noted that she had a military knife and asked where she got it. Ken Bok ran into another, lost his guard, and with a quick movement twisted his neck. They were caught off guard, so all attempts to neutralize the enemy were unsuccessful. Ken Bok was also very fast. I quickly dealt with one of them and jumped up to the second one, who took aim with his machine gun. Before he could even start shooting, Ken Bok was too fast for him, holding only a police baton in his hands. Guns be damned. Ken Bok knocked out the organization's mercenary with a baton in one blow. Suddenly, something flew past him and he froze in place. He quickly turned around and saw that there was another mercenary behind him, but he already had a knife stuck in his head, which Sandra had thrown. Ken Bok crouched down, allowing the mercenary to fall to the floor without hurting himself. If it weren't for Sandra, Ken Boku could have had a very hard time, so she saved him. He turned to her and, smiling, thanked her for saving him. The girl was embarrassed by his gratitude and, stepping over the bodies of the mercenaries, went to meet him. Having dealt with those who were nearby, they went stealthily further, trying to get as close to the zone as possible. But they did not take into account one point that would decide a lot about the success of their sortie. A drone was circling over the area, monitoring the area with a video camera, and quickly detected strange movement. He circled above them. Most incredibly, he could transmit information to someone who was in the outlet area. Sandra flinched when she saw the drone and immediately turned to Ken Bok, wanting to point out the danger to him. The drone descended lower towards them, and a voice came from its speaker, asking Kyung Bok if he was from the Foxtown Police District. Ken Bok thought that in this case, it would be better for him to pretend to be a policeman, and he confidently asked what was happening in this place. Through the drones, he was told that Foxtown was currently under quarantine, unless Ken Bok was told about it. The guy pointed out that there were survivors in the city, so they were conducting a rescue operation. They responded via drones that the infected zone was not under their control, and that management of the infected territory was transferred to the jurisdiction of Regenry Farm. Sandra couldn't stand it any longer and screamed, pointing out that these people were kidnapping survivors to use them as guinea pigs. They responded via drone that these claims were false, reported that all residents of the city were infected, and the military was doing everything possible to prevent the situation from developing. The girl screamed they didn't let the infected just die. While they told her that the areas with a high level of infection were under quarantine, the vaccine was already being developed by Regenry Farm. The girl pointed out that this was nonsense, and it was obvious that people from Regenry Farm were behind this situation and asked via drone to provide evidence of this information. Now Ken Bok was losing his temper, and asked again whether they should have given him any evidence of their words. They conveyed through the house that I was taking into account all the serious situations. They could not take my word for it, and would allow me to go into the contaminated area. Sandra screamed, asking if the safe zone wanted them to just go away and die. They promised to look into the matter via drone, but if proof was provided, they asked for it and promised to accept it. The drone immediately flew away, and the game system issued a new task to expose the illegal activities of Regenry Farm. Back at camp, Ken Bach and Sandra were disappointed to find themselves empty-handed. Sandra didn't understand what she needed to tell all the other survivors in the camp. Ken Bach tried to reassure her that she had done everything she could and promised to find another way together. Sandra awkwardly wiped a tear from under her eye, and then she suddenly stopped, as if she had been inspired by some idea, and informed them that they needed to hurry. They went into the hill, and Sandra called Billy and Lloyd, and immediately they, along with Ken Bach, discovered that there was trouble in the camp. It was very quiet, and almost next to the entrance lay the teddy bear of the boy who had given Ken Bach the coin for the machine. The girl looked at the toy for a short time, trying to comprehend what had happened. She began to look around, and her face changed with amazing speed. Her lips began to tremble, and she could barely hold back her tears, seeing what had happened in the camp in their absence. Everything around was destroyed. She fell to her knees with a scream from great despair and pain. Rain began pouring through the broken window, which gave the atmosphere a special dramatic quality to the moment. The bodies of those who had been in the camp were scattered around the hall. Someone had been here and dealt with them cruelly. Sandra hugged her teddy bear and cried loudly. The chat noted that in the original story, only adults died, and the children were kidnapped and used as test subjects. In this case, they killed everyone. Ken Bach heard something, and the chat immediately began to describe their hopes that at least one survivor would remain. Ken Bach, with his special sense, sensed that there was some kind of negative aura in the camp. It was definitely not a survivor. He felt that it was someone much more dangerous than a normal monster. From the other end of the corridor, a huge brute appeared and approached them. He looked very human, but an ordinary human could not do such terrible things. "I'm approaching," he asked in a disgusting voice if Ken Bach and Sandra liked his gift. They wrote in the chat that it was unfair. Such a monster was reasonable. The monster laughed, noting that he knew that the gift would definitely be liked. Sandra winced even more, now from horror. In this monster, she recognized Logan, whom she had executed with her own hands. Logan asked why they were staring at him and if there was something wrong with him. He said that in exchange for atonement, he handed over the stones that they treasured so much. And he noted that these insignificant creatures dared to resist him, and therefore he killed them. The system gave out that in front of them was a fusion of the giant and Logan. He really was huge in size and apparently was now the next boss of the game. Ken Bach trembled a little, thinking that this was too much, even though it was just a game. Ken Bach smiled, asking if he had crossed all the boundaries. The revived Logan was indeed huge, but he was also still very angry, which gave him more strength. Ken Bach held Sandra's hand, but the girl was already ready to rush into battle, despite how dangerous it was. Logan looked at them and smiled evilly, realizing his superiority. He said that he imagined how they would writhe in pain. As he spoke, he began to flex his fists. He talked about how he wanted to kill them as soon as possible, comparing them to small bugs, and hit the floor with his hand. Sandra only managed to shout to Purple, warning that the ceiling in the hall was collapsing. Pieces of concrete slabs rained down. She asked Ken Bach to take care of himself, as it was very dangerous, but he had already set himself the goal of dealing with Logan. The chat was saying that Logan looked really scary, and they were suggesting that the only option was to just dodge the attacks. Ken Bach read the comments and thought about it. The game system issued a new mission offer with a reward of 10,000 won for killing Logan by any means. While Ken Bach was pondering over the comments, the reward was raised to 60,000 won. Ken Bach saw this and read the comments and thanked everyone for their support, after which he smiled and said that he had wanted to beat up this bastard for a long time, and now he had even more motivation. He coughed awkwardly and corrected himself that Logan simply deserved revenge for everything he had done. In the chat, everyone really believed that Ken Bach could defeat him, even though it was difficult. Meanwhile, the reward for completing this mission began to rise. Sandra lay among the rubble of the ceiling and the collapsed wall, unable to move. She shouted to Purple that everything was covered with rocks and they probably wouldn't be able to get out of here. Viewers noted that no one could figure out what Sandra's role could be in this episode, and it was a fight to the death. Logan, meanwhile, glowed green in some places. Sandra noted through the gap between the stones that it was regeneration, which made the task even more difficult. Logan laughed loudly and asked for confirmation that his form was now simply incredible. Logan hissed angrily at Sandra that he wanted to save her for dessert and asked her to be patient for a little while. Kenbok, meanwhile, discovered that the weapon apparently didn't work, considering what his opponent was capable of. Well, he still took out his golden shotgun, and in his other hand he took a knife, which really surprised the audience. He watched Logan's movements closely and moved carefully around the hall, looking for an advantageous position for both defense and attack. Logan was overconfident in his own strength, looking at the smaller opponent compared to him. He believed that he could not be defeated. But Kenbok decided that the answer to everything would be his action and rushed at Logan. The chat was worried that he had gone head-on against his opponent, in which case just one mistake could mean failure. After a few seconds, Logan fell silent, his face contorted in confusion. Kenbok pierced his muscles with a knife, trying to aim for the tendons, which could be his opponent's weak point. But this was questionably correct, given that Logan had the ability to regenerate. Having inflicted several wounds on the enemy, Kenbok noted that the bleeding stopped quickly, but Logan needed more time for a full recovery. He fired his shotgun and shouted at Logan, challenging him to see how long he could hold out. Bullets began to penetrate Logan's body, hitting different places. The hall was filled with smoke from the shotgun, and it became very difficult to see what was happening around. When Logan tried to dodge the bullets and turned his back, Kenbok thought that there was still a fusion with a person. The tendon area, the connecting muscle, really turned out to be his weak point. Kenbok was trying to figure out what to do next. While in the chat, it was noted that the bullet was stuck in Logan's neck and was only going deeper. Regeneration was not working. Logan recovered from the shots very quickly and began to advance again. The chat advised to shoot again at the same place where the bullet got stuck, so that it would go right through. But Kenbok got exactly what he wanted, as the bullet prevented the tendons from healing and blocked tissue regeneration. Logan hissed, asking Kenbok not to get cocky, that without his little toy, he was nothing. He rushed forward, emphasizing that the real fight was just beginning. He hit Kenbok with all his might, and he, unable to dodge it, flew far back. But he managed to quickly group himself and turn into an advantageous position and prepare a knife for a sneak attack. Logan's next strike missed its target as Kenbok miraculously managed to dodge and jump to the side. Logan continued to advance, the beast furious and impatient to deal with the rest of his enemies. There was complete chaos on the viewer's screen, and they also noted this under the stream. Everything happened very quickly, and it was difficult to notice any details of the fight. Kenbok was rushing from side to side, attacking and dodging. Logan, despite his enormous size and apparent awkwardness, also moved well, trying to reach Kenbok. At one point, Kenbok made a miraculous attack, and with quick movements, he attacked Logan from all sides, inflicting numerous knife wounds on him. The cuts were very deep and were located all over the body of this monster. Kenbok jumped to the side and pointed a shotgun at him, saying that he wanted to check if a zombie could die from blood loss. This was followed by a series of shots. The shells fell to the floor, ringing playfully on the concrete. All the bullets that Kenbok fired hit Logan and got stuck in his body. Logan became very angry that he could no longer regenerate. Small cuts and scratches healed, but large wounds did not. Logan screamed that it couldn't end like this. I was still trying to restore tissue. Ignoring his wounds, Logan charged at Kenbok with renewed vigor, blaming him for all his troubles. He shouted that if it weren't for Kenbok, this couldn't have happened, and everything ended very badly for everyone. Outside, the building that had housed the survivors' camp until recently was shaking. The ceiling and walls continued to crumble little by little. Kyungbok barely managed to dodge one of the fragments at one point. Logan began to pick up the debris with his hands, intending to throw it at Kenbok and hope to finish him off that way. Dodge one of the debris thrown by Logan, Kenbok said that he wanted to shoot him with a few more bullets. The previous ones apparently weren't enough. Logan seemed to awaken a new wave of power for himself, and in the stream chat it was also noted that this boss most likely had two phases. Kenbok noticed that the debris lying on the floor and those that were in the air began to glow yellow, and arrows appeared on them. He immediately realized that this was some kind of hint to make a critical hit on the enemy. Without thinking twice, he started running in the direction of the arrows. He jumped from rock to rock, which were illuminated, and moved towards Logan. Sometimes he slipped, and when he was almost close to his opponent, he almost collided with another stone. They noted that the stones seemed to stop, and were surprised how Kenbok managed to do this. He continued his way and rushed forward. There were only a few meters left to the enemy, and this gave him a certain excitement. Kenbok jumped and struck Logan in the head, causing the monster to scream loudly in pain. He opened his mouth wide, screaming and trying to get something out of there. Kenbok saw that his police baton was already in the monster's mouth. Kyung-bok jumped again, pushing off from one of the debris and prepared for the most important blow. He fired a shotgun right into Logan's mouth, and the chat room was filled with jokes about him being a weird dentist. The monster's head was scattered into tiny pieces across the hall, and for a moment, Ken-bok seemed to hang in the air. The system confirmed that the mission was completed and the giant Logan was defeated. After which, a notification came that in addition to the sponsor, the squad together with 131 other viewers contributed a donation for a total of just over 2 million won, which greatly surprised Ken-bok. Ken-bok smiled and thanked everyone, noting that he thought it would be easy for him to kill. But Ken-bok didn't smile for long because the situation continued to be very dangerous. Everything around began to collapse. The publication was about to fall. Kyung-bok immediately ran towards Sandra as fast as he could. Sandra sat among the rubble of collapsed walls and ceiling, hugging her teddy bear and crying. Ken-bok saw how one of the debris was about to fall on Sandra, and his special strength manifested itself at that moment, accelerating it. A second before the debris fell, Ken-bok was able to push Sandra away from that spot. They rolled head over heels across the floor, but something seemingly inevitable was behind them. He helped her up, and they began to try to find a way out of the building. She held onto his shoulder with one hand, and he led her outside. But suddenly, Ken-bok was again struck by the feeling that there was something else behind the hotel that served as a camp for the survivors. He assumed that since Logan was in cahoots with Mercenary Farm, they would have been following him. He turned to Sandra. Something strange was happening around. A tear was running down the girl's cheek, and it was impossible to tell exactly what emotions she was experiencing from her appearance. She pushed Ken-bok away from her sharply and asked in a very serious tone who the hell he was. Ken-bok was a little taken aback by what happened and why she was asking such questions. The girl pointed to the wound on his hand. He looked at his hand, confused, and saw that it was glowing green and healing. Sandra screamed, saying that Kyung-bok was apparently a monster like Logan. The chat began to note that apparently the main plot meant little in this game. Sandra's face twisted and she asked the question again, or rather whether Ken-bok was even human. Ken-bok froze, not understanding what he needed to answer in such a situation so as not to ruin everything. She looked at Ken-bok's regenerating hands. She was not bothered by the rain or the destruction around her. Ken-bok himself was amazed at what was happening to the wounds on his hands because he did not know that such a thing was even possible. In the chat, they immediately noted that the plot of the game table is covered in secrets very suddenly. Ken-bok addressed the audience and emphasized that it was like content that was not in the main plot, and expressed that I can't think that the main character was not a human. After quickly looking through the comments, he turned to Sandra, who was waiting for an explanation from him. She aimed her gun at him, warning him that he had no right to take a step to the side. The game system gave a task in which it was necessary to convince Sandra to trust. Ken-bok laughed nervously at this, having no idea how he was supposed to do it. Chacha noted that it was probably almost impossible since Sandra did as she wanted. Ken-bok's hair and agreed to tell everything he knew. He emphasized that he would explain everything without lies and admitted that he himself did not really understand who he was. Sandra was indignant and warned that she could shoot at any moment, but Ken-bok continued to speak. He glanced at her and noted that the only thing he was sure of was that he felt the same way she did. The girl was taken aback. Ken-bok came up close to her and pressed his forehead to the barrel of the pistol she was holding in her hands and said that she could safely pull the trigger if she didn't believe him. The girl began to resist a little and carefully moved back. Ken-bok carefully put the gun down, trying not to make any unnecessary movements so as not to provoke her again. Sandra was confused. She apologized and quickly became quiet, trying to find some words to justify herself. Ken-bok carefully took another step towards her and rose slightly on his toes. He put his arms around her neck and tried to pull her closer to him, although she was still in shock and didn't give in. He touched his forehead to hers and asked her to trust him again, and Sandra began to cry. She pressed herself against him, and the game system indicated that the task had been completed and a new chapter was beginning. The game gave the choice between escaping with Sandra to Foxtown or liquidating the Mercenary Farm Company. Ken-bok thought for a moment, trying to guess what might await him in one scenario or another. Having made his decision, he clicked on the right button. After this situation, they did not focus on their survival and getting closer, alone in a city full of dangers. But the mistrust between them could not disappear so quickly, so it was worth trying. Ken-bok tried in every way to look after Sandra, treated her wounds, and protected her. In order to continue their journey together, they will have to overcome what happened and learn to trust each other. Tension was always felt, even when searching for food. They prepared carefully for the upcoming task, although the mistrust became stronger because of one thing. They managed to get motorcycles, which saved them a lot of time compared to if they had set out on foot. They had a reason why they had to survive in this terrible reality and find different ways to protect themselves. Ken Bok chose the mission to liquidate the pharmaceutical company Regenry Farm, and they rushed through the night city to their target. They stopped near the area owned by a pharmaceutical company since it was dangerous to go further on motorcycles. Sandra looked around and noted that these mercenaries had eyes and ears everywhere, and Ken Bok noted the strong security at the entrance to the zone. There were dozens of mercenaries around the perimeter of the building, and meeting them face to face would have been suicide. Ken Bok and Sandra were studying the situation with the roof of one of the high-rise buildings. Ken Bok thought about what could help them achieve their goal. Suddenly, the radio attached to his uniform began to make noise, and a voice came from there. The chat asked not to write spoilers because something interesting was planned. They checked on the radio to see if they had heard them, and Ken Bok responded by asking who had tried to contact him. Some girl tried to contact him on the radio, and when she realized that she was being heard, she said how worried she was because she didn't think she would be able to contact anyone. Ken Bok asked him to answer his question. The girl introduced herself as Jessica. She said she was a research assistant at Regenry Farm and asked if Ken Bok was a police officer, as she thought. The chat was very surprised. Usually, according to the plot, Sandra died and then Jessica appeared as the second heroine. The girl immediately shouted for them not to reject the connection, and she stated that she was going to expose this company and she needed help. Jessica explained that she was collecting evidence of their wrongdoing. She noted that she understood the police's loss of power, but she still continued to try to send radio signals because she needed help and wanted to believe that someone could do it. In the chat, they explained that according to the plot, the police were killed for trying to deal with the company. Jessica emphasized that she had to hand over the data to the military. She wouldn't be able to do it alone. Ken Bok looked at the company building and wondered how he could have gotten them. Looking around again, he said that he was not sure that he would be able to get inside. Jessica said that the building was connected to the sewer. This place was hidden from outsiders, and there should be no one there except special personnel. The system asked whether Ken Bok wanted to follow the mysterious interlocutor into the building, and offered two options to choose from. Ken Bok became a little nervous and rubbed his hands together, trying to figure out which decision would be the most correct. Well, I decided to pause the game and explained that today was fun and so many shocking events happened, but it was necessary to stop. The chat realized that he simply couldn't choose and suggested choosing himself. Ken Bok noted that the voting would be on the main page of his channel, after which he thanked everyone for being with him today and promised to meet at the next stream and waved his hand. Meanwhile, another stream began on the internet. He was dressed as a cat and started the stream by discussing the heat outside with his viewers. His name was Dalton Naya, and he was the main gaming streamer. Also, when the stream started, they sent me a donation with an attached video, and he immediately warned that he condemned it if there was something forbidden there. The video was a recording of Ken Bok's game. It was one of the scenes with Sandra. Naya immediately recognized the heroine and said that he wanted to scream with joy just at the sight of her. He started watching the video and was then very surprised. The videos were clips of newly discovered scenes from Bioeresis, where Sandra was pestered as a tender and vulnerable girl. Delta Naya promised that they would not ban this user, only if they explained to him what was happening in the video. He also received another donation with an attached video, which made him a little angry. But he quickly moved away and thanked for the donations and opened the next video with Ken Bok's fight with the boss of the second chapter. He was amazed by what he saw in the cut and said that most likely it was the best thing he had ever seen. He decided to immediately check all this on YouTube and started looking for Ken Bok's channel. He quickly found it and scrolled through all the existing videos, frozen in shock. I drew my viewers' attention to the preview of Ken Bok's video and noted that it was incredible. After watching the channel, he began to think out loud. After all, a newbie who rose so quickly will become an easy target for cyber saboteurs, and will he be able to cope with this? Early in the morning, Ken Bok went to his friend Ben Hun's house. Entering the door, he grimaced a little and was surprised that he was sleeping at such a time. He turned to Ben Hun and asked what had happened to him since the morning, to which he practically groaned that he needed a lot more coffee. He slammed his glass of drink on the table and declared that he would now show the reason for his condition. He took out his laptop, opened something on it, and shoved it in Ken Bok's face. After watching it, Ken Bok was a little confused because he was watching a video that was not created by the two of them. Ben Hun explained that they were being hunted. This was done by cyber saboteurs who were recalled by Delta Nya in his stream shortly before their conversation. Cyber saboteurs were people who quickly spread information on the internet. They were also the creators of YouTube, which increased its views with the help of clippings. But they did this not only by stealing other people's content, but also by creating clickbait videos with rumors. Ben-hun was furious. He shouted that they should have gotten their permission first and discussed the details, but they were breaking all the rules. Kenbok continued his thought. Each side had to find a compromise and asked if it was possible to complain about them. Ben-hun grimaced and explained that he wanted to do so. Well, he noted that the copyright to the game videos belonged to the developers, so it would be difficult to organize a complaint. Kenbok, hearing him, thought about it. Ben-hun put his hand on his shoulder and suggested that I should become depressed because of this. But Kenbok also protested that he had no intention of doing so. Ben-hun gave a motivational speech, saying that if there was a desire, then a solution must be found, and if there was darkness, then there will be light, and they will sail the entire seas. It was clear that he was the one who was most worried, but after his speech, Ben-hun chuckled, noting that someone had contacted them, spreading intrigue. Ben-hun continued to chuckle, pointing out the interesting expression on his friend's face, to which Kenbok asked in a serious tone to just say it straight out. Kenbok was also upset by this news and asked why Ben-hun behaved like that. Ben-hong silently held his laptop out again towards Kenbok's face, who didn't show much enthusiasm. But Ben-hun smiled as he explained that this was the first time something like this had happened in the streaming community. He showed the email he had received. It was hard to believe, but they received an offer from the official developers of the Bio Crisis. And then Kenbok perked up and stared at the monitor rereading the letter. Whenever videos from Kenbok's channel were opened, knowledgeable users immediately became delighted. The intro to the stream was incredible. It seemed like everything that happened was absolutely impossible to perform. It collected a lot of comments. People rated the quality and expressed their admiration. The intro ended with the face of the channel's main character, who was smiling and waving his hand to everyone. Kenbok began calling his viewers pearls, as was the custom among many different streamers who called their audiences words derived from their nicknames. Kenbok decided to make an announcement and asked for some attention. It was very important. He pointed his finger at one of the upper corners of the monitor. At the top, there was a note that the stream was sponsored by the Gap Company. He was again showered with donations. One of the first was from the developers of the game itself, who wished him a successful stream. Kenbok always thanks everyone for donations, but he also always thanked everyone for their interest in his business. Subscribers always supported and worried about his success. Before the stream began, he noted that he had to explain himself first. A few days ago, there were small negotiations between employees in the Gap Company cafe. One of the men noted that even though he worked in the sales department, it was a little strange for him to be the one who negotiates all the details at the meeting. The girl emphasized that this was their first key request for multilingual subtitles for all game videos. Another smilingly noted that it was beneficial for everyone, and that foreign viewers would also appreciate this decision. The girl then noted the explanation of Easter eggs, emphasizing that everyone would like them to be revealed as the game progresses. To the surprised expressions on her colleagues' faces, the girl explained that the final gameplay was significantly different from what was in the project. She gave the example of the giant Logan, who was not originally supposed to die. During the game, I had to dodge Logan's attacks, and then he had to escape, using the collapse of the building as an advantage. She demonstrated this using the example of a recording of Kenbok's stream, which defeated Logan and changed the plot. Some of the colleagues didn't even know this nuance. The girl said that some bosses were designed with the intention that players could survive by dodging attacks and avoiding direct combat with them. What he explained was that according to the results they received from the developers, the probability that players would open the secret route was 5%, and yet the chance of defeating such bosses was only 0.7%. Smiling, the girl corrected that this meant it was almost impossible to open another part of the plot, and her colleague noted that despite this, the newbie streamer managed to cope with it. Kenbok, who was sitting between them, became embarrassed and noted that it really wasn't that difficult and asked not to overestimate him. The girl coughed and continued saying that since there were hidden routes like this one, they wanted to ask him to explain their details on live broadcasts to prevent any misunderstandings. Noting the gameplay itself, the girl said that this was the intended strategy. Before his next stream, Kenbok said that following hidden routes was not the only strategy for completing the game. He explained that this happened extremely rarely, and if someone was going to complete the game, it was advisable to defeat all the bosses. And the developers also noted that his completion shortened some segments of the game. Made such a statement, he asked everyone to enjoy the game the way they want, taking into account all the possibilities. In response to controversial comments from viewers, Ken Bach noted that if they try it themselves, they will understand that it is not so difficult. The chat continued to be indignant, laughing at the fact that Ken Bach was apparently lying to them. In their eyes, he was incredibly talented in this regard, and it was believed that not everyone could do it like him. After scrolling through the chat for a bit and thinking, Ken Bach said that he also had one more statement for everyone. Discussing all the matters with Ben Hun, they came to the conclusion that everything sounded tempting and the prices were attractive, and there were no unusual conditions in the contract. Ben Hong asked him what he thought about the contract and emphasized that the decision was still his. Ken Bach trusted his instincts and thought that there was nothing wrong with it and probably that it was not worth thinking about the issue for long. He thought that if there were any problems here, they would have noticed them right away. But he still felt that something was stopping him from making a final decision, but he was not immediately able to understand what exactly it was. The girl waited for their answer with great excitement, and when Ken Bach asked if he could ask for one more favor, she shook even more. "But I'll try to pull myself together." The girl noted that they could discuss anything. Ken Bach also explained what was bothering him and what he wanted to change in the contract. The girl thought that there was no problem with this and gave her consent to these edits and promised to add it as a special offer. Ken Bach smiled broadly and thanked her. And on the stream, he said that he does not approve of the use of excerpts from his streams in other people's videos. He stated that his videos will now be classified as those supported by developers, and unauthorized use of his videos will result in a fine. At this point, he finished his speech and proceeded to launch the game. The chat supported his decision and rejoiced that all the scammers would be punished. A few seconds later, he was transported into the game and found himself faced with a choice. He suggested looking at the results of the voting, which he posted on his channel, to determine which choice they would make. He noted that those who chose the no option were apparently fans of Sandra, yet almost 90% voted for the option to go and deal with Mercenary Farm. He agreed with Sandra that this was a great offer, and they would be able to obtain evidence of illegal activity, and the system recognized this option and warned that the decision would affect the outcome of the game. Sandra immediately became indignant, noting that Jessica was also an employee of this company, and it could have been a trap. Ken Bach pointed out why they contacted them via police radio then, and stated that he believed her 100% and wanted to know more. Sandra tried to object. Well, using the game's hint, Ken Bach pointed out that your body could have been somehow connected to Mercenary Farm, and he explained that if they contacted Jessica, they would be able to find out much more information and would be able to help them. Sandra thought for a bit and eventually agreed, noting that she trusted him in his decision. They went through the sewers that Jessica had talked about on the radio. In the chat, they noted how realistic the sewer looked and that it was even a little scary. Ken Bach said the smell was not as strong as one might imagine, but was still unpleasant, and he covered his nose with his hand. But suddenly, he removed his hand and stated that the smell had suddenly disappeared. Ken Bach suddenly felt something and began to slowly back away towards Sandra. He pressed his back gently against her and didn't make a sound. The girl wanted to ask what was going on, but he pointed with his hand at her to keep quiet. After that, he whispered to her whether she had heard the same sound as he had, and noted that it was more likely that there had been someone further down the sewer. The girl was surprised, and it was clear that she had not heard anything. Ken Bach began to listen and caught some barely noticeable waves. He ran forward and pulled Sandra along with him. But still, he could not understand what kind of sound he heard, even though he used all his senses. He heard only an echo, and from it he could not determine what they had to fear. They sped up, although it was hard to run on water. The chat started arguing again about what Sandra and Purple would meet next. Without stopping to run forward, Ken Bach turned back, feeling that the strange sensation was growing. Some kind of creature was running after them, its eyes glowing with a bright red light, but in the darkness it was impossible to make out what exactly it was. The red eyes began to increase, and instead of one pair, there were definitely 10 of them. It was with great difficulty that they managed to discern what kind of creatures were running in their footsteps. These were huge zombie rats, of which there were most likely more than 10. Immediately, the sounds of shots were heard one after another. Still without stopping, Ken Bach turned around and tried to shoot them all with 2 pistols. The bullets reached their target as usual, and the rat mutants remained in place. Ken Bach tried to figure out what was wrong with the game's difficulty. He looked at the remains of the rats' bodies, but a strange feeling did not leave him. They were followed by huge flocks of these monsters. They were everywhere and crawled out of all the passages and cracks. They were on the ceiling, on the walls and the floor. The rats were ready to fall upon Ken Bach and Sandra in a mountain and tear them to shreds. At that moment, Donut from the Gap Company arrived with a signature that the rats did not need to be killed, and that one should simply run away from them. But Ken Bach didn't listen to this advice and started aiming at the monsters, saying that if they wanted the players to run, they would have to make the rats stronger. He began to shoot the animals one by one. Red eyes in the darkness, writhing shadows, quick steps, and a sickening stench. All of this was felt through Ken Bach's heightened senses. His eyes glowed a bright purple as he fired a bullet into the heads of these rats. Comments poured into the chat. Viewers also noticed changes in Ken Bach's appearance. Nobody doubted that he would cope. We read him not as a human, and even in the plot of the game this was revealed. Sandra simply stood there, and Ken Bach tried in every way to protect her from these monsters. And of course he succeeded. The number of rats was rapidly decreasing. The rats came running to the sounds of gunshots, and there weren't as many of mine left as it seemed at first. In addition to the 5 main senses, there was also a 6th one that scanned everything around. It was this one that Ken Bach had to perform the tasks assigned to him. He could hit the target without looking, knowing exactly where it was. He could also discern exactly how many targets were around him. He felt their movement, and thanks to this, he could deal with them with ease. What you noticed was that everything looked rather strange. It seemed like the pace was accelerating. Also, many admired Ken Bach's instant reaction. The rats were quite nimble. This did not stop him from killing them one by one. It was possible to follow Ken Bach's movements only thanks to the gleam of his knife that flashed before his eyes every now and then. But even despite the successful fight, Ken Bach understood that something was still wrong. That same feeling began to wash over him again with renewed vigor. He began to observe the movements of the swarm of rats, and as a result, he was able to understand what was happening. The rat now chose another target and moved towards Sandra. The sounds of gunshots were heard again. The viewers of the stream were very worried about their favorite heroine. Some people suggested what might happen in the next few minutes, but the majority of the chat asked no one to give spoilers. Ken Bach was as focused as he could be, but something made him lower his gun and stop shooting. The rats pounced on Sandra and were about to tear her apart. She could no longer fight them because they were too close. A message came into the chat warning that in the main plot, Sandra was supposed to die, but it was immediately deleted as spam. Ken Bach, seeing a swarm of rats flying towards Sandra, only thought that she would turn around and see the danger. Sandra's face was filled with horror as she noticed dozens of monsters attacking her. It was already too late to do anything, since these monsters were quite fast, and the girl herself did not have time to notice the danger in time. Ken Bach concentrated and pointed the gun at the animals. It was a very difficult task because he had to be careful not to hit the girl. Sandra seemed to have already resigned herself to her fate and tightly closed her eyes, thinking that dozens of sharp teeth would now plunge into her body. But her partner fired several shots. He quickly ran up to her, shooting the rats one by one, and in a few seconds the girl was no longer in such danger. Ken Bach had a great advantage in the quality of his firearms with which he controlled the situation. It didn't take him long to deal with such a danger and save Sandra. Some viewers were expecting Sandra to die, as was the original plot, while others were very happy that she was able to survive. But it also meant that Ken Bach listened to the developer's request by not running away from the rats. Ken Bach breathed a sigh of relief, noting that the rats had not crawled out again, but the system was very upset that he had been notified that Sandra had been infected. The girl looked at the scratch on her hand and trembled with fear. She didn't understand when she had managed to be wounded. Ken Bach approached her and tried to console her. At that time, Donut from the developers came with an apology and an explanation that it would not affect the course of the game. The guy realized that she would have become infected sooner or later anyway. A new task appeared. It was necessary to convince Sandra not to split up as she wanted, but to stay. Ken Bach asked her to work together. I note that Regenry Farm may be able to help. The girl quickly agreed, to which another donut from the developers came with wishes of good luck. Ken Bach wondered whether he should have listened to the advice of the game developers. But he noted that this was not his style. Even though the stream was sponsored, he said that he would still play the game the way he wanted. The comments supported him and were happy with his decision. Kyung Bach and Sandra continued to move through the sewers. Having reached one of the intersections, Ken Bach noted that this was the zone that Jessica had spoken about on the radio, and now it was necessary to climb up and get out of here. Sandra volunteered to go up first, explaining that she no longer cared and had nothing to fear, given her mortal wound. Ken Bach supported her, and when she almost reached the top, she told him to follow her up when her steps faded away. Ken Bach asked the girl to let him know if anything happened. She quickly climbed up and soon her steps began to fade away. After waiting a little and not receiving a signal about danger, Ken Bok began to climb up. When he reached the middle of the stairs, he heard a loud scream. Comments followed in the chat that it could be a trap. Going upstairs, he called Sandra and hoped that everything was okay and she was just scared of something. Seeing her, he was taken aback, didn't understand how to react to such a situation, and again tried to attract her attention to himself. Sandra grabbed the girl, who was apparently Jessica, and rudely told her about a pack of rats that attacked them in the sewers and demanded that they surrender. Well, Jessica resisted. I assure you that she does not understand what is being discussed. As Sandra continued to push and try to deal with Jessica, Ken Bok wondered if he should be happy or if this could be a problem. Jessica, almost crying, said that this block contained the results of unsuccessful experiments. If the conversation on the radio had been fake, she would not have come here for no reason. Ken Bok noticed her words about unsuccessful experiments and immediately asked about it again. The girl explained that the rats could have mutated due to improperly disposed of laboratory waste that they ate and apologized, emphasizing that she did not know about the mutant rats in the sewers. Sandra let her go and stepped aside, saying that Jessica most likely wouldn't be able to harm them, but still trembling, she thanked her for her trust. Jessica adjusted her hair and noted pitifully that she could have just calmly asked her about everything before attacking her. People started writing in the chat that Jessica was pretty good and that the developers could still make good characters. Ken Bok, reading this, smiled, happy that everything was going well. But Ken Bok didn't like the place they were in at all, and something told him that there was danger lurking here. He looked at the offended girls and thought to himself that this place was much more unpleasant than the location with Logan. He tried to figure out why he didn't like this place. He thought it might be because this building was where they killed the test subjects. Jessica approached him, deciding to introduce herself and explain who she was, to which Sandra emphasized that the situation was urgent and they could do without details, and immediately asked where the documents were. Jessica hesitated a little and asked to listen to her for a few minutes while she explained. She handed Ken Bok a flash drive, indicating that it contained the informant's documents that needed to be handed over. She also explained that it contained data on illegal experiments at Mercenary Farm, as well as the building's layout and operating plans. When Ken Bok asked about the failed experiments, she explained that it was related to zombies. Jessica then noted that they had to be taken to the director's office on the top floor, as that was the only way to contact anyone outside. Sandra began to doubt her words and expressed that they did not understand why Jessica could not cope with this herself. Jessica cringed, and with a trembling voice from fear that they would pounce on her again, noted that she was just about to tell about this and asked to be heard to the end. The girl continued, saying that all the buildings were guarded around the clock, and the director's office was guarded the most, and you couldn't just get in there. Sandra asked Jessica why you were sure that everything would work out. The girl answered that you can get into the control room and disable the security system for a while and has an idea how to deal with the mercenaries. The game system gave the task to share his doubts about the body with Jessica, and Ken Bok asked if he could get an answer to his previously asked question. Jessica continued to tell what needs to be done to get to the top floor. I am in a hidden passage that needs to be found. Ken Bok sensed something was wrong and asked Jessica to stop for a minute. Turning to him, Jessica saw that Kyung Bok was holding a knife in his hand and immediately became hysterical about it. She closed her eyes and covered herself with her hands. I assure everyone that she definitely wasn't lying. But Ken Bok, with a sharp movement, hurt his own hand and said that he had 2 questions. The girl slowly opened her eyes, beginning to understand that she was not in danger. She immediately noticed how Kyung Bok's hand began to heal right before her eyes and glowed with a bright green light, and noted that she had never seen such a bright light and asked when this began to happen. I was amazed by such rapid regeneration in a person and could not take my eyes off Ken Bok's hand. Chasika asked if he had taken any restorative medications and was horrified, assuming that he might have been bitten by a zombie. Sandra interrupted her monologue and approached them, asking Jessica to move away, pointing out that she was standing too close. Sandra pushed her away, even though Jessica was just talking and trying to gather some information. Ken Bok asked her to wait and asked Sandra if she was okay. Jessica couldn't help but order Ken Bok to freeze in place. Her boldness surprised the others and even left them a little confused. She came closer and continued questioning him, asking if he had noticed any changes in his memory, noting that his memories could become blurred. Ken Bok confirmed that he had no memory of what happened before he woke up in the hospital. He was surprised how she could know that. Jessica smiled widely and said that she had finally found him. The girl winced and apologized, explaining that when she is carried away by something, she does not notice what is happening. Ken Bok pretended not to notice and asked his question again. He knew that Jessica knew what was wrong with him. The girl completely drooped and lowered her head, and exhaling heavily, she briefly answered that it was an elixir. She explained that this was a treatment method that was being researched by the company Regenery Farm. This elixir has given rise to strengthening of the body and maximum regeneration, which appeared as a result of its intake. With this medicine, one could heal from any wound, even a zombie bite. The most interesting thing was that this elixir could give immortality. Jessica was carried away by her story about the ideal remedy for the ideal humanity. You could see the fire in her eyes and the delight from the realization of what she was talking about. Sandra and Kyung Bok were confused by what they heard and by Jessica's appearance. Jessica looked up at Ken Bok and pointed out that he was the subject of a clinical trial for the elixir. Ken Bok was even more taken aback. Everything he heard about the elixir was understandable, but he didn't know how many pitfalls were hidden in this story. Jessica understood that all such things were side effects. They were impressive. Jessica smiled and emphasized that Ken Bok should be happy. The situation had changed radically. She walked up to him and took his hand, trying to convince him that they should go up to the top floor to the research and development lab, because thanks to him, the company would be able to improve the elixir and fix everything. Jessica's eyes lit up even more with the idea, and she began to talk about how they had a chance to end the crisis right then and there. But she immediately received a strong slap in the face and an order to stop talking nonsense. Sandra was furious with what she heard from Jessica and pointed out that she could not allow him to be part of this crazy experiment. The girl stood in front of Ken Bok and blocked him with her whole body. Sandra turned to Ken Bok and asked him not to contact Jessica. Remember that their task was only to transfer the data. At that moment, Jessica got angry and called Sandra an idiot. Note that she did not understand that everything that was happening in the world could stop as soon as the development of the elixir was finished, because it was a vaccine for the zombie virus. And the argument was interrupted by a suddenly loud siren that went off, chilling me to the bone. A state of emergency was declared due to one of the test subjects escaping, and all building personnel were ordered to evacuate immediately. The research wing was quarantined. Kyung Bok shuddered and could only imagine what lay ahead. Kyung Bok was overcome with emotion. There was a noise on the upper floor. The sound was very similar to the footsteps of a thug. Ken Bok raised his head and began to follow the trajectory of this experimental subject. He felt a sense of foreboding come over him, as it had before. At that very moment, the roof collapsed and a huge monster with a sharp metal tip, instead of a hand, jumped onto the floor. Some of the wounds on his body as a result of the fall immediately began to regenerate. He was overly muscular, had a sharp metal spike instead of one arm, and was missing one eye, which was covered with something. Ken Bok stared at this test subject for a moment and scrolled through the chat to realize that it was some popular character. The game system immediately indicated that the quest to remove the overlord was open. Now Ken Bok had another assassination task. Immediately after that, the system issued another notification which really surprised Ken Bok. Early on, completing this task unlocked a hidden ending. The chat was very animated by this news. Of course, it was interesting to watch how this huge man in the past, and now only a consequence of an experiment, quickly healed his wounds. It was also interesting to see how he changed as a result of taking any of the drugs they tested on him. They turned him into a killing machine. And defeating him was worth the reward of unlocking a hidden ending. Ken Bok even found it a little exciting. He almost admired the strength of this test subject. Ken Bok seemed to be waiting for this moment, but suddenly Jessica pushed him aside. She grabbed him with her hands and began to beg him to believe her, pointing out that they should have run away from this place with the vaccine instead of filing a report. Alexandra laughed that the one who had escaped under the experienced one came exactly there to them and asked if this was not part of Jessica's plan. The game's theme gave him two options. He could defeat the overlord or give up and run away. Ken Bok said that they had come this far, and it would be stupid to miss such an opportunity. He turned to the girls and told them to use the secret passage and go to the surface, noting that this way they would be safe. But Sandra did not like this. She started yelling at him, saying that they wouldn't leave him alone with this monster. Kyung Bok carefully took the girl by the bandaged part of her arm. Sandra pulled her hand away and looked at it in confusion. Ken Bok asked the girls to accept his care because it was the best of all possible options. While Sandra was trying to get rid of the pain in her hand, Ken Bok promised that he would definitely return to them as soon as he dealt with the overlord. Looking at Jessica, he also added that they would figure out later what to do. Jessica stood there strangely dissatisfied. Sandra, after listening to Ken Bach, exhaled heavily, but still agreed to his request and asked him to promise that he would return, and Jessica at that moment already rushed to the exit. Ken Bach took a good look at Sandra and grabbed his gun. That look definitely meant he was going to go back to her. He took his pistol out of his bosom and pulled out an empty magazine. Having reloaded his weapon, Ken Bach was ready to begin another fight with the new boss of this game, fully trusting his abilities. The game system focused on the Overlord and marked the beginning of the hidden quest. Ken Bach turned to his audience and asked if it was time to receive the hidden final reward. He was smiling cheerfully and couldn't wait for the battle to begin. Before the capsules, the console version of BioCrisis had a character that was the final boss for many generations of the game. This character was the same Overlord that Ken Bach was going to fight. Overlord was a perfect biological weapon that was the result of countless experiments. His strength was equal to that of 10. His muscles and other body tissues were completely changed and acquired new characteristics. He was a Superman, or rather a super being, who was capable of everything. Overlord was the main villain who, according to the plot of the story, opposed the main character Ryan Kim. And concurrently, he was the king of zombies. Throughout the series, he appeared in various variations and was very difficult to defeat. But he managed to earn the recognition of experienced players who were happy with such complexity. Over time, the Overlord became a historically popular boss that even those who were not associated with the game knew about. The Overlord didn't think long and immediately pounced on Ken Bach and hit him with his iron tip instead of a hand. Ken Bach barely managed to dodge this blow. The chat noted that this boss became stronger as his series progressed, and it was impossible to defeat him with a simple pistol. But Ken Bach was obliged to try this option and fired several shots into the body of the game's main boss. Well, Overlord was very famous among players and spectators because he repelled any attacks well, just like this time. Ken Bach did not stop his offered shooting. In the chat, they hoped for his victory. I note the high speed of reaction. One of the bullets fired by Ken Bach hit the subject directly in the head. It got stuck in his skull and the Overlord froze for a while. The chat was surprised that it apparently worked. Ken Bach already noted that despite the fact that the Overlord was a zombie, even his head still regenerated. This was a very bad sign. The boss shook his head and rushed into a new attack, as if nothing had happened, and with a strong blow to the floor with his hand, threw Ken Bach aside. After Ken Bach recovered and ran at his opponent, it was noted in the chat that even he would have a hard time dealing with him. As long as he couldn't hit his weak spot, he wouldn't receive any damage. In the chat, they also noted that the final boss would not have been called that if he could be defeated with a pistol and a shotgun. Kyung Bach fired again and realized that this time the Overlord understood the trajectory of the bullet and let it go right through. It was incredible that he used the transformation in such a way. Ken Bach knew that it would be difficult and he would have to tinker with him. To begin with, he decided to study his movements and tried to dodge his attacks as best as possible and just wait for the next one. At the same time, he would sometimes fire a bullet, trying to find his opponent's vulnerable spot. Let's note that the game developers could be proud of themselves, because even Purple had difficulties with this boss. Ken Bach jumped around the Overlord, knowing that the only way to take him out was to exploit his weak points. He thought he had already figured them out. But the problem was that these weak points were hidden under the belts. In the chat, it was noted that a special item would be needed to defeat the Overlord. The other spectators were very surprised that Ken Bach did not have this item with him, but they were immediately asked to shut up. Although Ken Bach really did not understand what was being discussed. He tried to resist this brute who kept attacking him with new and new attacks. Overlord suddenly jumped up to Ken Bach and seemed to simply trample him into the ground. The chat even worried that the first retry might follow. They thought Overlord had crushed Ken Bach, but he jumped out from under his opponent's hand, saying that trying again would not be ideal. The audience was amazed by his physical abilities and intelligence. Ken Bach clarified that it was worth figuring out the belts first, and smiled. Ken Bach rushed towards his opponent, noting that it was very simple. Although in the chat they were surprised how he could cope with the belts without having a normal weapon. But none of his viewers knew about his superpower, which helped him even in the game's plot. Ken Bach tried to surrender himself completely to this bright feeling that was trying to lead him on the right path. Ken Bach noted one because of the rivets that held the Overlord's strap to his shoulder. He hesitated for a moment before he immediately pulled out his pistol and fired straight at that spot. The force of the bullet was enough to send the rivet flying to the side, loosening the belt. Ken Bach then fired another burst of shots, giving her opponent time to come to his senses and deliver his own blow. Ken Bok tried to shoot the rivet completely through the area, detaching it from his body and causing immediate damage. I saw on my screens what was happening in the game. The viewers were amazed that Ken Bok practically used her gun as a drill. The rivet flew off onto the floor, and from under the belt appeared the very weak spot of this monster that Ken Bok was trying to find. It was right in the center of his chest. But the overlord didn't seem to be the least bit embarrassed by the fact that his vulnerability was visible to his enemy. The audience was shocked that Purple had managed to do the job again. Ken Bok winked at everyone and said that there was no need for speed or damage-increasing items. He extended his hand forward and fired another burst of bullets from his pistol, aiming straight at the enemy's weak spot. With this, he said that this boss was not so tough, since it was so easy to deal with him. The overlord roared loudly and began to lean backwards. It seemed that this monster was about to fall to the floor. But still, something was wrong. Ken Bok felt that his magical sense pointed to it. Some huge red tentacles appeared from the overlord's chest, which indicated the power of this creature. Ken Bok immediately realized that this was a bad sign because his opponent was now becoming even stronger. The overlord began to degenerate. His flesh was torn apart by huge bone spikes, so it was clear that he was entering his second phase. His body was breaking. Well, he enjoyed it because it made him even more invulnerable. A new donation of 50,000 won came from the game developers with an explanation that if you break the core, you can immediately move on to the second phase, but first you should farm items. Well, it was too late for the developers to comment on this, as the overlord was finishing its transformation into a new phase. After which another donut came with an apology. Everyone was too busy watching that they completely forgot about this moment and told about it too late. But Ken Bok was no longer interested in this. Before him stood a real titan who was even scary to look at. Ken Bok was a little worried and looked into his uniform to make sure what kind of weapon he had with him. He immediately pulled out a golden shotgun from behind his back and took aim at his opponent, noting that he was in a bad situation. As usual, he didn't think long and immediately fired shotgun bullets into the subject's body. But as soon as a bullet got stuck in his arm, it immediately began to heal. The bullet stuck in it did not interfere with tissue regeneration. Ken Bok continued to shoot, although the chat did not understand how he could deal with him, since even bullets did not affect the monster. The overlord swung his metal arm trying to reach Ken Bok. In the second phase, the ordinary metal tip turned into a real blade, too sharp to want to get closer to such a creature. The chat immediately noticed such changes in the overlord who, without stopping, served to Kyung Bok, who barely managed to bounce away from him. Ken Bok fell to the floor. He shot the enemy's hand, but the damage did not go through. In the chat, they wrote that this monster had to be taken only with rockets. Otherwise, there was no victory in sight. Ken Bok ignored these comments and wondered what would happen if he stabbed the monster in the chest again. He could be reborn again, but he could also be significantly weakened if that was truly his weak point. In the chat, Ken Bok was called a fool and asked to start farming items, otherwise he could not win. Kyung Bok told the chat that they could continue to pick on him, but he saw no point in farming items, so he would act as he saw fit. That you didn't believe in his victory and said that he didn't want to ruin his reputation, but nevertheless he would still fall face down in the dirt. Ken Bok didn't pay any attention to such comments and did everything he had planned. It didn't matter to him what they said about him. Getting close to the overlord, Ken Bok raised his golden shotgun as high as he could and fired straight into the center of his chest. He then fired again and again, making a whole burst of shots, all aimed at the same place. The overlord glowed with a bright light that scattered in all directions. This color came from his chest, and it could only mean one thing. His spines and ribs began to crumble and break from bullets and began to heal more slowly. In the chat, they quickly changed their tune, noting that they believed in him from the very beginning and drove away those who did not trust the skills of the main character. But after some time, regeneration still reached you other parts of his body and slowly began to heal them. Overlord was too strong. It was not worth choosing another method. Ken Bok smiled and said that he had a reason why he would not farm items. He watched as his main rival in this game ran straight towards him, but he stood still, not moving at all, and slung his shotgun over his shoulder. He addressed the audience and asked them to watch him closely because of the boss. He was too calm and promised that only when they watched him more closely would they be able to understand what was happening. The overlord's core glowed with a bright green light, which signified his rebirth, his strength increasing, and his wounds healing. Ken Bok spoke about the reason why he did not run away and farm, but decided to fight in direct combat with this enemy. He stood confidently in front of the overlord and smiled. It was a very important moment in the game, and many spectators were waiting to see what would happen as a result of their battle. Ken Bach said that everyone would definitely find out about it if they just kept watching the live broadcast. At that moment, he had to quickly dodge the boss's blow. While running away from his opponent, he continued to fire from the golden shotgun. Watching this fight, subscribers noted that if Ken Bach gets caught by this boss, he will immediately die. Ken Bach believed that he needed a gun simply to buy time. His goal itself was higher. He took into account Jessica's words about the animals that were used in the experiment and found it strange that there were no devices for processing nearby. Watching the Overlord, he assumed that the fluid that flowed from his wounds washed out the irritant and restored the wound. After thinking about this, he decided to use this ability of his opponent to his advantage in order to gain victory. He smiled and said out loud to the Overlord, something was much harder for him to use the hook than his hand. He grabbed his golden shotgun, ready to attack. He fired, noting that he simply had to hold out as long as possible. Viewers noted that his performance was similar to the film, and they were very amused by the fact that the main character uses the legendary golden shotgun. Ken Bach does everything he can to the Overlord to wear him down even more and reduce his regeneration. When he managed to knock the boss down, he breathed a sigh of relief, noting that now everything was finally calm. After looking around, he turned to the audience and asked if they knew where he was. After the Overlord collapsed, it caused the floor beneath them to collapse, and the two of them found themselves on the floor below. Ken Bach said the place looked like where Regenry Farm got rid of the experiments. He fired upward, aiming at one of the pipes running under the ceiling, and began to talk about the only possible reason why there were no special devices. Some kind of liquid starts to flow out of the pipes that were hit by the bullets and splash all over the hall. Ken Bach shared the solution, noting that unsuccessful experiments were thrown away after dissolving in this liquid. This liquid hit the Overlord and began to dissolve him into bone spikes and tissue. The audience was amazed at how the main character was able to think like that before and use this liquid to defeat a serious boss. Even though the poisonous liquid was eating away at the Overlord in seconds, he continued to regenerate. Ken Bach wondered how long his opponent could hold out like this. Watching as the Overlord froze in place and tried to fight off the caustic liquid, viewers of the stream compared Ken Bach to a mad scientist. Seeing that the Overlord had finally started to get up, Ken Bach was indignant that he had absolutely no manners and fired another shot from the shotgun. The bullets hit the monster in the arm and also in the leg, forcing it to stop again. Without wasting any time, Ken Bach moved up close to his enemy and abruptly thrust the barrel of his shotgun into the very weak spot in the Overlord's chest. The monster did not try to resist, as he was busy with the strong restoration of his body, and Ken Bach noted that this was the very height he had spoken of earlier. He fired a shot and the monster flew back. His artificially created heart trembled. The Overlord was defeated, and the game system immediately reported the completion of the task and the opening of a hidden ending. The enemy was left with only practically corroded bones. The game workers dropped the donut with gratitude, although they were surprised that Ken Bach's tactics worked, but asked to remember about the historical rocket launcher. Ken Bach rolled his eyes. Let's talk about them using a rocket launcher like the bosses of the previous series, and promised to leave it for them. Ken Bach walked around the room a bit and noted that in principle it was gentle, whether this experiment was legal or not. He decided that he would go through the closed passage, because if he does this, he will see the hidden ending. He approached the steps that led up. He climbed up to the floor where the research and development room was located. The room was huge, and he was surprised that the company used the entire floor for such tasks. He called Sandra and Jessica. Although they had agreed to meet at this place, they were nowhere to be seen. Suddenly, Jessica jumped on him from behind and started screaming about how scared she had been the whole time. She hugged him tightly and didn't want to let go. Turning around, Ken Bach was taken aback and asked Jessica what had happened to her appearance, and also asked where Sandra was. Jessica looked battered. Her face was covered in fresh bruises. The girl began to stammer, trying to explain what had happened, but she still pulled herself together and noted that Sandra had lost her mind. And although Ken Bach's face did not express trust in her, she tried to convince him that Sandra had attacked her and then gone upstairs. Ken Bach immediately felt a sense of foreboding, just like he had in the control room. He pulled away from Jessica's embrace and asked in a rude tone what that could mean. Jessica's frightened look was gone. Instead, she became irritable and declared that Sandra had turned into a zombie. Ken Bach didn't know whether he should trust her and pointed out that he had to see it with his own eyes. Jessica was indignant that he did not believe her. She said that it was the pure truth and that it was the first time she had seen people transform so suddenly, and pointed out that the effect of the virus was slow, and she herself initially doubted it. Jessica assured that the bite was definitely from a zombie, and Ken Bach was horrified. Sandra turned into a zombie from the bite of those rats that they met in the sewers. The girl folded her hands near her chest and pointed out that there was a way out, and if Ken Bach agreed to become part of the experiment, they would create an elixir and be able to save Sandra. Ken Bach broke out in a cold sweat. He looked at Jessica, who stood with tears in her eyes, and begged him to take this step. The game system offered a choice to agree to her offer, or to look for Sandra on your own and see for yourself. It made Ken Bach think about how he didn't know for sure if Jessica was telling the truth, and the decision was really hard to make. He concluded that compared to last time, both options were not ominous, and asked whether in any case the vaccine was needed to save Sandra. The system recognized this as an agreement, and Jessica breathed a sigh of relief, noting that he had made the right choice. The girl walked up to the control panel and pressed one of the buttons. The wall in front of them began to move apart, and a bright light began to shine through the resulting gap. Many viewers were surprised that there was a hidden passage in the wall. Ken Bach covered his face, protecting his eyes from the sudden source of such bright light that he had become unaccustomed to it. They stood there as the wall completely disappeared and the light source grew stronger in power. At this point, the chapter of the game was over. Ken Bach smiled at his viewers, noting how quickly this chapter of the game ended. The developers donated to him again with new thanks and wishes for him broadcasting at such a late hour. For a moment, Ken Bach paused to read the comments from his viewers. He was a little confused, noting to himself that he probably should have done it his own way, but he was simply confused, so he paused the broadcast. After looking at the details of his broadcast, he discovered that it was already midnight, but about 3,000 people were watching it. He understood that all his viewers were used to him stopping the broadcast after completing each chapter, but he decided that this time he would go all the way to the end. Looking at the large number of comments and viewers who still hadn't left his broadcast, he realized something. He didn't want to leave them and disappoint them, because they stayed with him at such a late hour. He wanted to share the pleasure with them and part on a happy note. He wanted to experience that feeling again and thought it would be much more fun. But suddenly Ken Bach remembered his friend Ben Hoon, who at that time was himself performing the duties of editor and manager, and thought that it might be better for him to end this broadcast. And at that moment, Ben Hoon himself addressed him. This address left Ken Bach a little confused. He watched all this carefully and noted that he did not want to wait for the hidden ending and asked for a continuation to finish the game for this broadcast. Ken Bach laughed and noted that it was no surprise that Byung-hun was his friend. The title of the broadcast changed, and the viewers were happy that Ken Bach decided to continue playing. Ken Bach noted that in any case, the next chapter should be the last one. Instead of dragging it out, they will watch the ending and go to bed. At that moment, Ken Bach became a little scared because a lot of notifications began to appear. A large number of donations poured into his broadcast. Ben Hun opened this function in time. And the guys definitely made the right decision by doing this. Many started sending money in honor of their gratitude. Ken Bach pressed his hand to his chest and pointed out that he always talks about this, but was still grateful for both the viewing of the broadcast and the donations of his viewers. Another donation came from the developers. They indicated that they were happy to continue the broadcast and will stay until the end together with everyone else. Ken Bach clapped his hands, marking the beginning of something incredible. He began to say that before they lost their spirit, they would already have time to finish this game. He announced the beginning of the 5th chapter, which was a hidden ending that no one saw. Ken Bach followed Jessica as she showed him around the lab and led him somewhere. Ken Bach felt like this place looked like a secret laboratory that was not accessible to everyone. For a second, he froze and saw something in front of him. It made him very nervous, and he asked Jessica what it was. The flasks contained various creatures floating in a special liquid. Jessica explained that these were the samples that formed the basis of Regenry Farm. Passing by one of the flasks, a human hand hit the wall inside it. Apparently, all these samples were alive, which was incredible. Jessica noted that it was amazing, but Ken Bach did not fully understand what he felt when he saw these creatures. Jessica said that it was their early experiments that had partial genetic compatibility that led to partial immortality. She also explained that the elixir was only effective for those with absolute genetic compatibility. For example, Logan and Overlord were more advanced versions. Ken Bach began to guess what Jessica was talking about, and without letting him finish the question, she replied that the guy was not the only sample for the experiment. But Ken Bach was the only one with perfect genetic compatibility, so he was a very valuable asset to the company. And at that moment, some machine grabbed him and shackled his hands and feet. When Ken Bok woke up, Jessica immediately noted that it was just in time and everything was already ready. She thanked him for his help in improving humanity and for his future help. Ken Bok was now in one of these capsules himself. His arms and legs were chained to the inside of the flask. Jessica asked him not to worry and promised that after the elixir was created, Sandra would be saved. Ken Bok did not like everything that was happening to him. Apparently, it was too late to do anything. Jessica smiled and noted that now that they were doing this, she could explain everything. She explained that the elixir that was supposed to be humanity's greatest vaccine had only one side effect. It led to loss of mind and a desire for blood. It was an instinctive result of searching for the right genetic combination that they did not have. To make the elixir safe for everyone, they needed a successful sample from which to extract the full compliance rate. So they took advantage of the side effects and conducted a large-scale clinical trial using a small amount of the elixir mixed with the drug. But in that case, only people with the ideal genetic factor would survive. Ken Bok grinned and noted that it was now becoming clear to him what had really happened, and wondered if they weren't concerned about the loss of human lives. Jessica continued and said that they eventually managed to find the perfect specimen, and the sacrifices were necessary for the good of humanity. She began to move towards his flask and said that now, thanks to his sacrifice, everything could return to how it was, and humanity could make great progress. She was holding some kind of syringe in her hands and laughing, saying that soon the whole world would greet her. Ken Bok finally understood what was happening, and that he was in this position not because Sandra would soon be saved. From the open doors of this laboratory, a voice was heard calling him, and Jessica immediately stopped in pain after the sound of the shot. He turned around and saw Sandra in front of him, who was now saving him. The girl was very scared, but she acted very confidently and clearly. And it took a few more shots to free Ken Bok from the handcuffs. It took a little time and Ken Bok freed himself from the capsule. Falling to the floor, he cursed at what had happened. Sandra promised that she would explain everything to him on the way and told him to follow her. Ran after Sandra, Ken Bok finally understood why everyone who knew about this game was a fan of Sandra. But even though Jessica was already dead, Ken Boka still had that bad feeling. They ran to the elevator and Sandra applied a special pass card to the required sensor. She explained that this elevator led straight to the director's office, but it could only be opened with one card. She noted that they would climb up to the roof through his office, and since it was quite high, it would take some time. Entering the elevator, Sandra began to tell that as soon as they went up to the top floor, Jessica suddenly attacked her. She assumed that Jessica thought she would be prevented from luring Ken Bok, but Sandra was able to steal the pass by fending off her attacks. As soon as she managed to get a pass and escape from her attacks, she immediately ran to the director's room. In this room, she found something. Sandra handed Ken Bok a magazine clipping with an article about the presentation of the director of Regenry Farm. The photograph showed a photograph of a woman who was actually the director of this company. Sandra and Ken Bok were reminded of someone, and they concluded that Jessica was her daughter. Suddenly, Sandra groaned and grabbed her arm. On her forearm was the same wound from a bite, most likely from a rat. Ken Bok asked her how she was feeling, but she ignored him and began to scold him for how he could agree to the experiment, pointing out that he was almost killed. Ken Bok threw up his hands and said that they explained to him that this was the only way to save her, and Sandra froze in place, not expecting such an answer. While Sandra was confused, Ken Bok addressed the audience and noted that apparently, regardless of his decision, the vaccine would still be impossible to obtain. Sandra started laughing, but Ken Bok couldn't understand why she was having so much fun. Their situation wasn't the best. Sandra blushed and said how glad she was that Ken Bok was okay. It didn't take long to get to the director's office on the top floor. Ken Bok noted that the army had sent a helicopter to the roof, and in response, Sandra suggested finding other evidence and leaving. Sandra noted that they needed evidence regarding the elixir. The game gave the task to find 3 clues and go to the roof. After a little searching, Ken Bok found all 3 pieces of evidence he needed about Regenry Farm's illegal activities. Looking around the office, he noticed a computer that was very similar to the main one, and Ken Boku became very interested in what was in it. Approaching him, Ken Bok immediately discovered documents in which his name was mentioned. These documents even had a photo of him after he defeated Logan and the hotel collapsed. The computer turned on and asked for a password to log in. Kyung Bok wasn't surprised that the computer was password protected and decided that the word elixir would be perfect for it, and it worked. The computer started up. People in the chat immediately started writing that they had never seen a computer start up, and on the first try at that, and they started asking to look inside all the folders on it. After trying to open several folders, Kyungbok said that apparently all the files were protected by some special password and he couldn't find it. But one of them was still unprotected and he managed to open it. This folder contained video materials which somewhat confused Kyungbok. He opened the video and hoped there were no jump scares while he waited for it to load. The video was footage from a CCTV camera in the director's room. Chat was asked to turn on the sound. The guy running in the video looked very much like Kyungbok. The system was not in order, so he needed to send USB to files through the communication device. He went to the computer and tried to send data through the designated channel. When the files were sent, he requested immediate assistance and was told that troops would soon be there and was asked to wait. He sat down on one of the chairs and exhaled heavily, noting that finally everything was finished. He bent over and expressed regret that there were too many victims and named Jessica and Sandra among them. Well, he tried to cheer himself up and, smiling slightly, emphasized that at least now everything should be as it once was before. In the chat, they wrote that it looked like a normal ending and soldiers were supposed to come out soon. And so it happened. Mercenaries appeared in yellow protective suits and with weapons. According to them, the sample was saved. They took Kyungbok by the arms and began to lead him out of the building. A woman standing in a cloud of dust asked to redirect the channel back to the outside channel. It was Jessica. She stood in the respirator and said that she had to tell the news that the elixir was ready. She reached for the flash drive and said how she hated that this ancient machine automatically switched to the internal channel as soon as the device was connected. Walking away from the computer, she said that Regenry Farm's security measures were incredibly well thought out and that this was precisely what formed the basis of this security. She looked somewhere into the camera and hissed that it was his fault that he was able to trust. Kyungbok was delighted with what he had seen, noted that it was now clear what had happened in the original ending, and said that he would like to experience it all over again. He took the flash drive out of your pocket and showed it to his viewers. He also said that he didn't think that the flash drive that Jessica gave him was so dangerous, and now he needed to personally deliver the evidence. Having checked all the evidence for safety and accuracy, he decided that now they should move quickly, and he and Sandra ran to the exit. Having run out onto the roof, they stood waiting for the helicopter to land. The helicopter was still quite high, and although they should have hurried, they had already completed all the main work. Suddenly, he was again pierced by an incomprehensible premonition that made him shudder. The feeling is much stronger than when he met the overlord, and he wondered if he would now meet the final boss of this game. Suddenly, a beam of light pierced the helicopter and it began to fall, smoking heavily. It was definitely intentional, but Sandra and Kyungbok had no idea what was going on. The helicopter tried to stay in the air, but eventually it crashed and exploded. Around the table, very thick and dark smoke rises. In the chat, everyone was also worried. The smoke rose higher and higher and became blacker. Through it, a certain silhouette began to appear, resembling a woman's, with burning and bright blue eyes. Kyungbok was aided by his strength, which meant he could not be caught off guard. He knew that this chapter couldn't end so easily, and his premonition was true. Jessica stood before them. She was not dead, and apparently she herself was one of the experiments. Kyungbok and Sandra were stunned by the sudden appearance of Jessica, who turned out to be dead. Kyungbok grimaced and watched as the risen from the dead Jessica advanced on them. Sandra was even more surprised by this, as she had shot her several times with her own hands. She said that she had no more words to comment on what was happening. Jessica didn't look quite like herself. She had very strange movements and bright blue eyes that no longer indicated that Jessica was the same girl everyone knew. Sandra couldn't understand how Jessica could stand in front of them when some bullet had hit her right in the head, and that should have killed her forever. Jessica stopped nearby and pointed out the situation, emphasizing why she couldn't stand fools. She threw something on the ground. These were the same bullets that had been in her body until recently. One side of Jessica's body was covered in bloody patterns that gave off some kind of blue tint. She was definitely not an ordinary person anymore, and said that Sandra and Kyungbok had only made things more difficult for themselves. Jessica began to change before our eyes. New body parts suddenly grew out of her back, similar to spider legs. Most likely they were much more deadly. In the chat, they noted that apparently she experimented on herself, so now, even after death, she managed to be reborn. Jessica turned to Kyungbok, who was still standing in place next to Sandra, unable to move. "I'm finishing my transformation, Jessica." It turned out that Kyungbok's genes were hers too, and she smiled evilly. Sandra screamed, telling Jessica to shut up, and fired several shots at her with her gun. The bullets hit the creature straight in the head, but they immediately began to tighten, only briefly confusing Jessica. With one sharp, very light movement of one of her paws, Jessica pushed Sandra and Kyungbok away. Having quickly grouped up and landed, they both began to shoot at Jessica with weapons. Well, it seemed that her spider legs were armored because the bullets just bounced off them. Sandra's arm was in great pain. The infection was spreading further through her body, but even so, Sandra screamed that Jessica looked like a coward. Meanwhile, Ken Bach was watching the situation closely and shouted to Sandra about the danger and ordered her to come down. But he decided not to wait for any reaction from her and rushed at her to save her from the approaching danger. I have a girl from Jessica's attack. Ken Bach again made a few shots holding Sandra with his hand. He fired his shotgun upward, either to drive the helicopter away from the site or, on the contrary, to urge it to quickly come down and pick them up. Jessica turned into a clod of something incomprehensible. She began to look more like some kind of bone cocoon, finally turning into some kind of creature and saying goodbye to the appearance of a human. Later it turned out that the helicopter was guarding Jessica. At that moment, a new donut from the developers came. They noted that this segment of the game assumed the presence of an RPG protagonist. Kyung Bak agreed. This was exactly the weapon he was missing, and added that that is why they recommend everyone to find it if someone suddenly wants to play such a game. Ken Bach tried to shoot down the helicopters with his pistol, although it was rather pointless. It is likely that the helicopter's glass was bulletproof, but Ken Bach decided to try his luck anyway. To everyone's surprise, the helicopter's glass burst under the bullet and the shooter inside was killed. Ken Bach took aim again, his wide smile never leaving his face. He fired a few more shots at the helicopter, which should have caused it to short-circuit and catch fire. And fortunately, everything went according to Ken Bach's plan and thick black smoke began to come from the helicopter. And soon, an explosion followed. Ken Bach closed his eyes tightly, not letting the bright light blind him. Some small particles could get into his eyes. Jessica hissed that Kyung Bak had missed his chance to give up. During this time, she had come back closer to some semblance of a human, although many limbs were visible from her body. The game system revealed that it was an evolved overlord. Viewers appreciated this transformation and noted that the developers adhered to tradition. She made a movement with her hand, cutting through the air. Jessica hissed, noting that she wanted to get rid of her nuisance first and then take care of everything else. Sandra was extremely unhappy with what was happening, but most of all she was betrayed by her helplessness. The infection began to spread faster and had almost reached her shoulder. Ken Bach tried to shoot back, stopping fire for a long time. He tried to find her weak spot, although he initially assumed that it was located where the previous boss of the game was. First, Jessica should at least be stopped a little. After the unsuccessful attack on Sandra and Ken Bach, Jessica was very surprised. Meanwhile, the bullets continued to hit her, causing her to stumble back. Sandra turned to Ken Bach and noted that her pain was passing, and she wanted to fight with him. Ken Bach emphasized to himself that at least this time, he himself would participate in the fight with them. From what Ken Bach understood, Jessica could modify her body better than any other overlord. It allowed her body to move unpredictably. There was no way to tell what the next change would be, or what part of her mutant body she would choose to say it with. Ken Bach decided there was no point in aiming for her weak spot. The best he could do with his gun was keep her at a distance. He knew he had to find some stronger weapon to even out their strengths a little bit. He was having a hard time resisting Jessica and was able to dodge at the last second. He began to think that since they were on the roof and the helicopter was empty, there was nothing around that could be useful. But suddenly an idea came to his mind. He turned to the iron barrel standing nearby. I had aviation fuel, which I could definitely help him with. The fuel was most likely used as a spare, that's why there was only one barrel there. He dodged another attack from Jessica and ran towards the fuel. Jessica immediately noticed where her main opponent was heading. Ken Bach hoped that this barrel would be enough for him and ran towards it as fast as he could, throwing his shotgun to Sandra along the way. Sandra did not expect such a throw and almost dropped the weapon from her hand, screaming loudly. Ken Bach asked her to hold on for a while he tried to fix the whole situation. The audience was outraged that Purple used Sandra as bait. She only had one working hand, but he explained that the gun had a fairly low recoil, so you can shoot with one hand. Also, Ken Bach explained that the shotgun had much more setting power than the pistol. It was simply a better weapon. Sandra wasted no time in bringing the weapon to the task. But no matter what the audience said, Ken Bach was going to help Sandra, and without stopping began to reload his pistol. After firing a few shots, he finally got to the barrel and grabbed it tightly. Ken Bach smiled like a little child at the sight of new toys. He picked it up and was very surprised. The barrel was too light for him to lift it above his head. Ken Bach shook the barrel a little. I heard that there was very little fuel inside. He froze, trying to figure out what he should do next. They were trying to pull themselves together in the chat because they really wanted Sandra to be saved. He swung and threw the barrel forward in front of him, seemingly with great anger. He immediately kicked the barrel. The meager contents of the fuel in the barrel began to spill onto the floor. The spectators did not understand what he was doing because this fuel was so valuable to him at that moment. After spilling fuel across the roof, Ken Bok rolled the barrel to the very edge of the building. He sat down carefully and looked down, indicating that everyone should look after him. Below there were hundreds, maybe even thousands of infected zombies who seemed to be waiting specifically for him. Meanwhile, Jessica continued to try to destroy Sandra, who, despite her injury, continued to fight. Just before Jessica could hurt Sandra, Ken Bok's voice was heard ordering her to stop. He called out to Jessica, and she noticed him and turned in his direction. Sandra stood frozen in her place, holding the shotgun in her hand, not having the slightest idea what her partner was planning. Ken Bok stood on the corner of the building, raising his gun and pointing out that Jessica needed to be much faster. He noted that he was going to jump down if Jessica wanted to save her jeans. She began to react faster. Jessica immediately rushed towards Ken Bok, screaming. Ken Bok watched her carefully, waiting for the moment when she would be in the right place a little closer to him. Jessica wasn't looking where she was running and stepped into the jet fuel that Ken Bok had spilled. As soon as her foot touched that small puddle, he fired. He was aiming specifically at this fuel to provoke a spark and set it and Jessica on fire at the same time. In a split second, everything burst into bright flames. Jessica screamed loudly as she found herself in the very center of the outbreak. Ken Bok smiled contentedly as he watched the wonderful show he had created with his own hands. At that moment, Ken Bok jumped into the roofs. Jessica, in complete despair, rushed after him, screaming. In the chat, they were already expecting to pass this task again. I think the main character died. Jessica tried to make it and save Ken Bok, as he was very valuable to her. She did not pay attention to the fact that she was all ablaze. Without thinking about the consequences, she jumped after him, but she didn't realize that Ken Bok could have grabbed onto the wall and not actually fallen. He greeted her mockingly and fired the last shot, immediately saying goodbye to her. The bullet hit her in the head and she fell down like a stone. Climbing back onto the roof, Ken Bok noted that whenever something came into her head, she froze for a while. He said that Jessica had survived the fire. It was extremely interesting how she would survive the fall. Jessica was approaching the ground with a blaze. In the chat, viewers were amazed as Ken Bok managed to stick a knife into the wall, a gun, and discuss his fire trap. The system reported that the main mission was 80% complete and victory over Jessica had been achieved. Ken Bok climbed onto the roof and exhaled, happy that everything had gone according to plan. He looked down and noted how much elixir Jessica had used, but it couldn't save her. He chuckled that she must have had genes that might appeal to the zombies that were already waiting for her down below. The developers, having sent another donation, expressed their admiration for Ken Bok's ideas. The children did not think that such a thing could be done without the necessary weapons. Ken Bok came to his senses and rushed to Sandra, and immediately noticed her hand, in which the infection was progressing. Jessica backed away from him and assured him that she was fine and asked him to concentrate on escaping. Ken Bok started to talk about how they needed to find a better way to do this, but he was interrupted by some noise. Sandra's face twisted in horror. Ken Bok immediately turned around to where the loud noise was coming from. Along the walls of the building, a multitude of zombie monsters climbed straight to their roof. They were not stopped by the smooth surface of the walls. They clung to them with their claws like suction cups and rose upward. Ken Bok didn't understand what was going on, but he grabbed his shotgun. It would also be his readiness and said that they still wouldn't be able to withstand all the zombies, and they needed to evacuate as quickly as possible. They were surrounded on all fronts. What was embarrassing to you is that the developers really expected the main characters to fight such a horde after defeating the main boss. Zombies poured out of the doors that led into the building. There were dozens of them. They were everywhere, and it turned out that their numbers were inexhaustible. Ken Bok and Sandra started shooting back at them at the same time, but in the chat, viewers were very doubtful that everything would be okay. Blood and zombie brains were spraying all around, and the sounds of a continuous stream of gunfire could be heard. Ken Bok and Sandra continued to shoot back, although the zombies did not become less numerous, but on the contrary, it seemed that their number was growing with every second. At one point, it seemed to them that everything was over, but then immediately even more zombies appeared than before. I get the impression from Ken Bok that they weren't supposed to defeat them all, and he was expecting some event that would change the plot, although he didn't really understand what their real goal was in this situation. Ken Bok thought it was impossible with just a shotgun, and they were out of pistol ammo. It felt like the game was deliberately trying to make them waste bullets. The game system notified about the task completion. It turned out that it was really necessary to wait until the ammo runs out. When Sandra asked about the availability of ammo, Ken Bach indicated that only the shotgun remained. Sandra was sweating profusely, and her face was already showing signs of infection. She had apparently taken out her last magazine of bullets, but she still showed great courage. They continued this fight for a very long time, trying to destroy as many zombies as possible and save their lives. They were standing next to each other, but suddenly Sandra began to move closer to Ken Bach. She reloaded his gun, which surprised him greatly. He tried to object, asking why she did it. Sandra said that these were her last supplies and asked Ken Bach not to give up. I emphasized that she had no doubt that he would be able to get out of there. She put the gun to her forehead, adding that he would be able to do it if he was alone. Preparing to take a shot from his hands, she admitted that Jessica had offered her a deal. Jessica had previously pointed out to Sandra that the virus was slowly affecting her, which was strange. But since the infection was not stopping, it was obvious that she was missing genetic factors. Jessica tried to offend her that she should have joined them, for her own good. Sandra was sure of what she said, and noted that he would never allow Purple to be experimented on. Jessica smirked, and based on that she pointed out that the purpose of conception was the exchange of DNA. Sandra became very tense at that moment. Jessica looked at her and smiled. It was unknown that Sandra was carrying Purple's child and asked her if she wanted to hear something interesting. She came closer to her and said that even with the vaccine, if Sandra loses her mind even once, she will never fully become human. Even if the child needs the genetic factor, then after all, the child will never be born. Jessica felt like a winner, and surprised that Sandra had not yet told Purple anything, decided to propose to her. Horror asked her to join the company and then her child would survive. And besides, the experiment would not kill Officer Purple. Jessica smirked and asked Sandra to make the right choice, which depended on several lives. Sandra held the gun to her head and noted that it seemed like a good idea, but she refused because she couldn't trust and was glad she made that choice. She was sure that I would be kept in experimental rooms, as if in prisons it was not like real life. Ken Bach grabbed her hand and pulled the gun away from her head. He didn't understand why the girl hadn't told him about it before and asked her what the reason was. The viewers of the broadcast of this game really wanted Sandra to be saved because according to the plot of the game, she did a lot for this city. Sandra noted that she thought the decision was the most correct one and smiled. Ken Bach was shocked and didn't know what to do until Sandra said that she would rather he live remembering her than become an experiment. Sandra said that her last wish was to die quickly. She absolutely did not want to turn into a monster in front of Ken Bach. The girl tried to fight Ken Bach's hands and tried to return the gun to her head. In the chat, everyone was praying that this would not happen. Sandra said that she did not regret a single moment that she spent with Ken Bach. She smiled, even though she understood that she was about to say goodbye to life. Ken Bach froze in place. He learned that the girl was carrying his child at the moment when she decided to end her life, and with his hands at that. Ken Bach came to his senses and fired a shot, followed by another. The zombies had gotten too close to him while they were talking. There was no point in reducing their numbers. Looking at Sandra, Ken Bach was even more surprised because the places where the infection of old age appeared glowed green, and he immediately pointed it out to her. He looked at this green glow, which gave a chance that the ending would be good. But meanwhile, the zombies were becoming more and more numerous. Every moment could be their last, because they practically did not have time to shoot back, having only one shotgun. The zombies were already too close to them, but they continued to fight them with the last of their strength. And finally, a helicopter appeared above them, from which an armed man jumped. He immediately began to destroy the zombies, having the appropriate weapon with him, giving Sandra and Ken Bach the opportunity to rest and escape. He landed in front of them, blocking the exit of the approaching danger. The man backed up closer to them and asked if they had been bitten, to which Ken Bach assured that they were both perfectly fine. Hearing this and believing Kyung Bach's words, the man ordered the zombies to duck and released a bomb. It also exploded, destroying almost all the monsters that had managed to gather on the roof. The explosion was immediately followed by a signal fire, which gave a signal to the helicopter. The helicopter immediately flew closer and a ladder fell from it. Ken Bach picked up Sandra, letting her lean on him, and they walked closer to the thrown-down ladder. The man who continued to shoot back promised that he would cover them and ordered them to run first. Following them, the soldier immediately stood up and continued shooting back at the advancing zombies. The monster continued to reach for him, not realizing that they would be able to grab at least someone. While the helicopter was flying away, one of the soldiers continued to observe the situation below. Looking at Sandra and Ken Bok, he noted that their faces did not express happiness, even though they had managed to survive. Sandra, looking out the helicopter window at the destroyed city teeming with zombies, thoughtfully drawled the sound, trying to find the right words. The soldier said instead that once you lose your mind, you will never have the opportunity to become a human again, and that is the only reason you should not stop. Alexandra was confused by these words, and she immediately asked how the military man knew them. She looked at him intently, trying to see his face through the darkened mask, and asked him directly who he was. The girl immediately panicked and lost her temper, and pointed her pistol at the military man. Note that it was strange how they knew where to fly to rescue him. The soldier rubbed his helmet and apologized, explaining that he was just reminiscing about her old times. A tattoo appeared on his neck, and the dorm's broadcast immediately started talking about it. The soldier took off his helmet, revealing himself to be a young man and introducing himself as Leon Kim. She said that she used to be a police officer, but now she worked in the army, and indicated that she could only say that she was investigating this case. Ken Bok silently assumed that he could have been in some special unit of the army, since that was the only thing that could explain his equipment and helicopter. Leon Kim continued and explained that he was able to identify him after they contacted the drone, and then he tracked their movements. He was glad that he managed to save them in time. Ken Bok believed him and, smiling, handed him the envelope and asked him to accept it. Ken Bok had provided the evidence of Regenry Farm's illegal activities that the mission required. Leon stared at the envelope, realizing what was in it. He was a little confused by this, and for a short moment he looked suspiciously at Sandra and Ken Bok. Well, after that I exhaled and smiled, noting that the guys apparently had something to tell. But after that he pointed out that they should have a good rest before sharing all their adventures. He praised them, noting that their work was brilliantly done. They flew over the city with open doors, watching as they moved further and further away from that ill-fated place. Finally, Leon Kim suggested that the guys work together in the future. At this point, the 5th chapter of the game ended. But after the main quest was completed and Ken Bok managed to uncover the company's illegal activity, the game's system issued an epilogue unlock. All viewers of the broadcast were very surprised that the game was not yet over, and they still had to find out some details. At first, the ethologist could tell that some time had passed. A strong explosion occurred in the Regenry Farm building. The military got inside and began collecting information. An interesting personality among them was a man in a raincoat and hat who stood out significantly against the background of armed and armored soldiers. He said with great disappointment in his voice that no one had completed the task in the end. He looked at Jessica, whom he had addressed earlier. The glass that protected her portrait was broken. The most important target was the computer of this laboratory, which was hacked first. All passwords that the system required to log into the account were hacked, and access was unlocked. They were attentive to every detail and checked every file that was on the computer. The man was interested in a project called Infinity. He transferred all the files to his drive. Having checked on his tablet whether this scam had been successful, he smiled smugly. He walked to the edge of the building, to the place where there was a huge hole in the wall from the explosion, and ordered his men to continue the opening of the city of Fox, as planned earlier. He stressed that one failure was more than enough for them. After watching this piece from the beginning of the epilogue, Ken Bok expressed his assumptions that the sequel should be quite interesting. Then Ken Bok started getting donations from viewers, from Byung-hun, who begged him to play the second part of this game, and from the developers, who thanked him for revealing the story they wanted to share. Ken Bok asked everyone to continue to support the bio-crisis. I noted that I had a lot of fun, and it was great to enjoy the game together with the audience. He thanked everyone who was with him until the end and promised to meet at the next broadcast. At the end of his broadcast, Ken Bok noted that it was a sponsored stream, and without answering viewers' questions about what game he was going to play next, he ended the broadcast. Ken Bokham's Biocrisis playthrough blew up the internet. Dozens of articles were written about him, many forums were created, and now he was really popular. He received praise from the developers for being the first to see the real ending. Over time, a new loyal following of Purple formed, who couldn't wait for his next broadcasts. On his channel, Ben Hun posted a vote for the next game. He couldn't miss anything. The next morning, the Biocrisis community was in the process of voting to discuss other games. There were those who regretted the end of the Bark because the loyalty to the Bark president was so ardent. Everyone was sincerely waiting for Purple's next broadcast, putting forward their suggestions. And for Ben Hun, it was quite a heart-wrenching story. Ben Hun was very tired. The video was a lot of work, which helped Ken Bok to stay at such a level of fame. Ken Bok, seeing that his friend had fallen asleep again while sitting, noted that he looked very tired. Byung-hun shuddered at the voice and continued to say that people's reactions to the continuation of the broadcast were good and there were many posts. Ken Bok, bringing him a drink, noted that he looked like a zombie. Although Ben Hong was almost exhausted, it was time to look at the voting results, which cheered them both up. They opened the voting and looked at the statistics. A total of 3,200 people took part in the voting. Ken Bok was delighted by the large number of votes, but Ben Hun asked him not to rejoice too soon. Ben Hun pointed out that when the content ended, there were many who left and not everyone who voted would come to watch the stream, so there would still be fewer people. Ken Bok thought about it and agreed with him, noting that everyone had originally come to watch the bark and how they would react to the new game was unknown. The mere thought that the number of spectators might decrease seemed very offensive to Ken Bok, even though he was morally strong. He decided it was necessary to lower expectations before they collapsed due to impatience and finally decide on a concept. Ben Hun, still very sleepy, put his tablet aside and asked Ken Bok what game he wanted to play, which surprised him greatly. Ken Bok was amazed that he had to decide this without taking into account the vote, and Ben Hun emphasized this again and pointed out that if there is a certain concept, then there will be regular viewers. He also noted that there were those streamers who played only one game and became experts in it. Some focused on one genre, such as horror, and broadcast games that tickled the nerves. There were people who never touched full games and only played online games. Ben Hun pointed out that the channel must have a clear identity to get into the algorithms that will bring some fame. Ken Bok agreed with his friend and thought about it. After a moment of reflection, Ken Bok shared that he felt something, albeit briefly, while he was streaming. He compared the feeling to when he was preparing for pro gaming, when he thought that everything would work out if he just played well. However, this turned out to be a big mistake, but it was important how fun it was. He asked if he enjoyed the game. Would the audience who would watch him and feel the atmosphere enjoy it too? He noted that if they liked it so much, he would definitely feel better about it. He said that he was grateful for the votes, but he would still choose what he would play because then the streams would be more fun and interesting. Ken Bok expressed that even if Ben Hun did not agree with him, he could not give in because the persecution in the frame would change the relationship between them. Ben Hun was confused but still did not know exactly what game Ken Bok wanted to play next. Ken Bok thought about what kind of game he could play with several people, something like online games. Ben Hun covered his face with his hand and cursed. Ken Bok became a little nervous and asked if his idea was really that bad. Ben Hun didn't know if he was saying that because he didn't know or if it was the other way around. Ken Bok exhaled and asked how bad his idea was, to which Ben Hun told him that he was a very good person, and these words seriously scared Ken Bok because the beginning of his speech was not joyful. Ben Hun knew that with such skills, Ken Bok would naturally stand out among gamers, and if he was lucky he would be able to meet other streamers, and then he could lure viewers. Ben Hong stood up from his chair and took the tablet with him. Throwing him over his shoulder, he said that Ken Bok could do whatever he wanted, and he himself would take care of everything else and prepare what was needed. Ben Hun noted that Ken Bok could run as much as he wanted. This sounded very pleasant, but nevertheless led to great confusion. Ben Hun said this because despite his knowledge, he trusted his friend very much. He knew that he was a genius and would get what he owed anyway. Ken Bok exhaled and began to go over in his head the options for games that suited him. Well, after some thought, he suggested skipping the stream this coming weekend to give himself time to think things through. But Ben Hun was, to put it mildly, not delighted with such a proposal and immediately became furious. It seemed like his scream could be heard throughout the city. He didn't understand why Ken Bok had made such a decision, since there were more viewers on the weekends. He was shaking with nerves, but Ken Bok just smiled and didn't really explain anything. Well, you're at the right moment. Ken Bok pointed out that Ben Hun should have a good rest, because it was tiring to be responsible for so many things alone, and it even affected his appearance. Ken Bok jokingly asked him if he was really human, because he looked worse every time he saw him. He had huge dark circles under his eyes, greasy hair, and his clothes hadn't been washed for a long time. Ken Bok pointed out that there was no arguing with this and suggested hiring a manager during the vacation, and if Ben Hun wanted to last long, he had to be in shape and rest. When he finished talking about this, he laughed loudly and noted that he looked like the head of a black company. And having calmed down a little and looked at his frightened friend, he tried to convince him that he was very exhausted. But Ben Hun was quite offended by these words, because he was the one who was in a hurry not to lose the current good results and therefore worked so hard. He smirked and said that even the mighty Lee Kyung-bok didn't know, He should be grateful that he had such a person next to him. Ben Hong leaned on the refrigerator, saying that if he took proper care of this body, he would be able to move into Namkum, and this was called hidden power. Ken Bok, who was still sitting on the floor, laughed again and remarked that it would have been better if he had never found out about it. Ben Hun knew that Ken Bok would always keep up the flow, but he had already noted that it was too much information for him at one time. Suddenly, Ben Hun's eyes opened wide and ideas sparkled, and he noticed that he had someone in mind for the vacancy of their manager, and he was a very reliable person. Ken Bok made a joke about the words about a reliable person and looked at the tablet that his friend handed him. Ben Hun noted that even if he didn't know about the streams, if he trusted their data, he would join. It was raining outside. The man was walking with a huge suitcase under an umbrella and talking on the phone. They apologized to him, saying that he needed to come earlier tomorrow. The man said that he didn't understand at all why the team of administrators had to go on business trips and whether he should have quit in the end. They told him that it was not easy to report such a day off. She was sure that the management was involved in the embezzlement that he accused him of. They told the guy that they were going to go with him to the end because he was reliable and trustworthy, but they were no longer able to help him. They promised to send the schedule and apologized again. The man put the umbrella aside and raised his head to the sky, letting the raindrops run down his cheeks. The only thing this guy wanted was to rest. He was disappointed, exhausted, and unhappy. Having reached the right building, he opened the doors and carefully began to roll his suitcase inside. He tried to understand where he should go, because he didn't quite understand it. After walking a little down the corridor, he realized that it was too dark, and he didn't like it. There was a noise in the hallway, and turning around he saw two silhouettes. He needed to go that way because his house was there. Well, judging by the sounds, it was clear that something had happened. One of them entered the code for the door, and the door opened. The other asked if they were really that close. It was surprising that he knew the code for the lock. The guy approached the two. Ben Hun immediately noticed how cold it was around them, and the guy, without delaying the moment, pointed out his presence and asked what they were doing. Ben Hong turned around and smiled, noting that he was harder to meet than Mountain Ginseng. And Ken Bok explained that they had come to see him. The guy smiled tensely and asked them if he also allowed them to behave like that, but suddenly fell silent and then invited them to come in. The guy warned that the inside of the house is still as scary and nothing has changed. Ken Bok checked in. Only the location of the house has changed, and the password has been the same for 10 years. Having taken off their shoes and rested a little, they sat down at the table and began to discuss the purpose of their unexpected meeting. The guy they came to was called Park Joo-ho. He was a mutual friend and worked as an assistant manager of a large company. He was surprised that they wanted to hire him as their manager. Ken Bok and Byung-hun assured that they were really serious about their streams, so the app was more than just serious. Joo-ho asked to stop the advertising mood and still couldn't figure out whether his friends were joking or not. But he thought that although it sounded good, in reality management was an unstable job for a career. He decided to turn them down before they got too much hope in him. He didn't want to think about it too much, so that he would refuse it easily. But still, if they weren't friends, he would refuse in a heartbeat. He looked at them. In their eyes there was hope that he would be able to accept their offer, and the three of them would work very profitably and comfortably. Byung-hun half-whispered and jokingly pointed at Joo-ho's serious face, and Kyung-bok responded also jokingly that in that case, he would have to do everything himself. After thinking for a while, Joo-ho suggested postponing the question of his career in that case and asked about the amount he would receive as a salary, noting that all issues needed to be discussed. Byung-hun took out his tablet and said that it was not a useless proposal on their part. He smiled widely, understanding that they would be able to convince Joo-ho to cooperate. He handed Joo-ho a tablet, letting him see the terms they were offering, including the salary. Byung-hun pointed out that they received 9 million from donations, another 3 million from advertising, and there were also good amounts for YouTube videos. Joo-ho's face changed when he learned that such amounts were made in just a week. Ken Bok leaned over to him and grinned, emphasizing how great it was, considering the number of viewers was only growing. And on top of everything else, it was also fun. Joo-ho was shocked by what he saw. Ken Bok noted that it was impossible to put a value on it, but intuitively it was clear that they had received genuine support, so they wanted to be even more diligent. Byung-hun hugged Kyung-bok tightly and laughingly asked Joo-ho if he had made a decision yet, pointing out what a genius their friend was. Ken Bok said that they needed his help, but in addition to that he would receive such treatment at work that they would want to take him with them. Ju-ho noted that he was reminded of the old days when they also tried to play games. Whenever Ju-ho was having a hard time, his friends changed his life for the better. They always made me smile and not think about bad things. This was the case in high school and after graduation, right up until the present day. Byung-hun began to shout joyfully, noting that Ju-ho was smiling, which could mean that he agreed to their proposal. But Ju-ho still resisted, they say, that he should have thought it over. Ken Bok pointed out that he was going on vacation anyway, so it was a good time to just try it out and then make a decision. Ju-ho agreed, since he couldn't quit his job right away anyway. Byung-hun raised his drink and shouted that he completely agreed with him. Ju-ho also raised his drink and was surprised that the atmosphere was as if everything had already been decided. Ken Bok smiled, understanding his can, and assured him that once he tried it, he would understand everything and be able to make the right decision for himself. They clinked the cans and Ken emphasized that this should be a lot of fun. But Ben-hun was the happiest of all, already looking forward to both his rest and the presence of a good, reliable person in their work. At the same time, Ken Bok drew attention to himself and said that he had a few words about the next game. He drew out the intrigue, speaking very abruptly and building a pyramid out of cans and bottles. He said he wanted to play a game that meant a lot to him. A new stream started and he said, "You thankfully chose carefully watch the poll's introductory video." He also kept the intrigue going for a bit, not immediately saying which game he had chosen. He announced the next game to be the Mystic League. The chat was surprised that she was chosen. It was quite an unexpected statement. Some people didn't like Ken Bok's choice and noted that he would probably have to move to another stream. But Ken Bok wasn't scared at all. He simply smiled, knowing that those who would understand him and share his interests would remain with him. He was confident in his success, and nothing could upset him anymore. And so it happened. Many still supported his choice and could not wait for the new broadcast. Of course, there were many who didn't understand why they should do anything else if everyone liked Bark and could continue playing it. The audience didn't quite believe that the choice was based on the voting results because it was strange that people chose this particular game. As planned, the next broadcast did not take place on the weekend, and viewers immediately bombarded Ken Bok with questions, trying to find out the reason. Immediately after the broadcast began, Ken Bok drew attention to the number of viewers, which was already about 800 people, although the stream had previously attracted more activity. Responding to the comments, Ken Bok assured that he, too, was eager to start a new broadcast and show everyone a new game. But he was not only relaxing over the weekend, he folded his hands and, declaring victory, asked the audience to greet someone. He introduced the new member of their family. Ju-ho's manager wrote that he was pleased to meet him and suggested that they get along. Several donations came in asking which game will be broadcast now. Ken Bok began to talk about the main topic of the day and emphasized that he made his choice long and carefully. He smiled, hoping that the majority would support him. He introduced the game Mystic League, although it was not as popular as, for example, the previous Bio-Crisis. The audience was surprised. For them, this choice was unexpected, and they were probably hoping for something else. Some noted that this game was at the very bottom of the voting and was unlikely to get the required number of votes. But Ken Bok tried to ignore the not-so-positive comments and launched the game. It was released by the developers of the most popular PC game League of Legends. This game was a continuation of virtual reality, so you can enjoy it by becoming the character yourself and live everything as vividly as possible. 5 players as a team destroyed the enemy's tower and weapons. The easiest way to win is to destroy the center of the camp and the temple in turn. If it didn't work out in time, the winners were determined by personal records for kills, deaths, and assists. It took place in different locations on different maps, and each player had a specific role. This game required both strategic team play and individual skill. Ken Bok noted that, as expected, there were many fans of story-driven games among the audience, and naturally they did not like his choice. Many viewers indicated that they would come to the stream. Yes, the game will be different, but Ken Bok emphasized that there was a reason for his choice. Thought it might be because he started with Bark, but many voted for the story game. But when he was in high school, he was offered to join the professional team Lola. He noted the names of Tion, Gendi, Kivon Dia, who were only the leaders, then noted that he quit the game and did not join the team. A donation came to the stream, asking why he gave up playing LOL. Ken Bok understood that he could not talk about his illness, and therefore answered that this was how family circumstances developed and difficult things piled up. But she also added that everything has already worked out, and now his family would be happy to see how much love he receives, so he definitely wants to play the sequel to Lola on the broadcasts. Some of his viewers supported his choice, stressing that with his participation, any game would be interesting. Ken Bach said that he played Mystic for the first time but wanted to do it energetically. He opened the game settings and selected rating games. The audience was very surprised that he did not even go through the training, but immediately began to play for the rating. He was transported to the battlefield. Ken Bach's rating was Bronze 0, which surprised the audience even more. It didn't seem like such conditions were his style. Ken Bach had to prove his skills in 7 fights. In this game, he should have been free to support his team without a specific line during the game. Accepting the fight, Ken Bach was happy to return to the game after a full 10-year break. He chose Jungler as his hero and turned to his teammates and asked how lucky they were. The loading went very quickly, and Ken Bach was ready to tear apart all his opponents. Juho asked Byung-hun if it was normal that he suddenly started with a ranked game, but he received the answer that he behaved as usual, and for him it was normal. Juho noted that even the controls were different from the PC version, and it was essentially a different game. Ben-hun noted that in Mystic, you could become a character I, and most of the previous ones were replaced. He smiled and said that Kyungbok hadn't changed anyway. Juho looked at him in surprise, not understanding where he was going with this. Ben-hun explained that if he was a regular player, he would not have received an invitation to the Pro League, but he had a good sense of reading the map and the ability to manage the game. Ken Bach had already appeared on the map, next to his teammates, and was waiting for the battle to begin. Ben Hong watched the screen with delight and concluded that he was also expecting other parts. He explained to Juho, he understood little about it. The growth happened primarily after the match. It was purely Lola's method. The concept of growth in mysticism was removed, so skills were the player's level. You can't transfer skills through the game, so if you only choose a character well, you could expect success. And Ken Bach just finished choosing a character. Byung-hun and Juho moved closer to the screen, waiting for someone incredible. Well, when he saw the game character, Ben-hun was very upset. He thought that Yami was not the best character in Ken Bach's situation. Ancient times, a ninja who became skilled in vision. This was the characteristic of the character Yami. This character specialized in magical assassinations and had 5 different skills. That the character was successful, unlike the PC where you can click on your skills, in the game through the capsule, you will have to implement the transformation yourself. It was very difficult in the fight, immediate reaction, although Ken Bach was really a genius, but it was worth considering his huge break. Ben-hun noted that the character could not perform a basic attack because he could not use his hands during the transformation. As long as he was a killer, he was weak and extremely vulnerable if he got close to the enemy. Ben Hong was angry and freaked out, and from the emotions that overwhelmed him, he slammed his hands on the table. He thought the character was very poorly created. Meanwhile, Ken Bach was taking over the power of the hero, who was already tied to the account's default avatar. All players have finished selecting their characters, and the countdown to the battle has begun. One of the team members addressed Ken Bach, and he turned tensely in his direction. They told him that everyone on the team was new, but he should have at least watched the video beforehand because his character wasn't quite right for his role in the game. Another member pointed out that Ken Bach had ruined his whole thing with his terrible choices and was so rude from the start. Looking at the disgruntled faces of his team, Ken Bach was surprised that his character was so shitty, although according to the video review, he showed everything to him as very good. I try not to pay attention to the indignation of my teammates. Ken Bach found it strange that in the present time, they did not use the magic of the killers. In the times of Lola, it was the best choice for such a role. At that moment, he was sent a new mission, the task of which was to win 5 games in a row on such a character, and in case of defeat, admit his stupidity. Purple smiled and thanked him for the new mission he had been looking forward to, noting that avoiding such an expensive mission would not be his style. His friends immediately changed the title of the broadcast to the question of whether it was possible to strive for 5 victories in mysticism. The countdown ended and the battle began. Ken Bach ran first across the map, promising that they would do everything perfectly. He waved to his team, noting that he had no choice and he would definitely win this game. One of the characters was outraged that Purple had a rather strange concept and called him an attention-seeking troll. Ken Bach ran across the map and, reading the not entirely pleasant comments of his viewers, was not at all upset by them. The first thing he did was run into the forest, as his role required. He met with the guards, who were in the form of huge mutant rats. He quickly ran past them. The chat was still indignant. I note that it was the first time they saw how this particular character was chosen for such a role, after which Ken Bach was sent a donation, and explained that his character's attacks were mediocre, even if he was not tied hand and foot, which is why junglers were always criticized. The chat started writing about a 3x3 player game, where on the contrary, this role was highly valued. But Ken Bach was amazed by this and noted how much the game world had changed while he was absent from it. He prepared himself to fight these mutant rats, to gain experience and train his skills. He said that learning should be a lot of fun, and now that fun was about to begin. He rushed into the attack without thinking twice. He warned everyone that he would first try to play in his own style. There were 25 skills in total, 5 attributes corresponding to each of the 5 stages, and the higher the level, the more gestures and sequences accumulated. It was possible to hate Yami, who had to remember everything and act independently, so most people didn't like him. Purple climbed a tree to look around. He needed to focus on identifying all his skills and capabilities. Of course, he relied on his strength, his intuition, which should help him this time too. He had the feeling that someone was painting a picture in his head, and his senses perceived the emerging movement. It was like a person learning to walk and gradually getting used to running. He closed his eyes tightly and concentrated completely on his sensations. Fully focused on his goal and possibilities, he opened his eyes. He knew that he would succeed, and after this short meditation, he was completely confident of it. He instantly jumped down from the tree branch. Using the right gestures, he revealed his hero's power and prepared to attack the rats. He used one of the skills and resorted to the power of healing. He knew what he was doing, and therefore he had every chance of successfully completing this fight as a whole. Using the property of toe in the 3rd stage, he summoned a stone giant who was supposed to help him. The giant struck the ground with all his fury, sending cracks through it that quickly spread to the mutating rats. The chat was delighted that Ken Bach got the 3rd stage of this skill on the first try, and all the mobs were defeated. Ken Bach continued to build up his power and used it a little to heal himself. It was very beautiful to look at from the side. It was surrounded by golden spheres that were spinning around. Ken Bach smiled, pointing to his skills and thus proving to the audience that they could be wrong. He was happy to feel this feeling again, and used his character's skill again. This served as a little training and learning, and noting that he had also gotten used to the skills, he was ready to move on. He flashed forward down the line, using his strength and skill to great effect. He suggested that viewers immediately go ganking, which meant helping other lanes kill players on the enemy team. Ken Bach quickly got into the game with the hope that he would be able to successfully use all the skills of his character and prove his viewers wrong. He took part in one of the very first fights between players from the 2 teams. Well, fortunately, the enemy team turned out to be stronger and reacted faster to the lead. The player noted that the health of the rest of the players on his team was at a minimum, and they were all in trouble. One of the players used the dodge skill, which was a magnetic pen. I can pull one of the players to me, but it didn't work, and the player was freaking out that all the attacks were shooting past the target. Ken Bach arrived just in time for this fight. He practically appeared out of nowhere and blocked one of the players with his body. He used the 4th level throat attribute, which was an endless attack, and directed it at one of the opponents. Ken Bach yelled at his teammates to act faster while they still had the time he could give them. Another player joined him and also asked the others to listen to his advice. The players ran forward, avoiding additional attacks and trying to regroup to attack themselves. Ken Bach assured everyone that if the whole team couldn't do it, he would be able to cut out the opponents on his own. The opponents were already advancing on him. I assume that he is not capable of anything and will not be able to repel their skills. Well, everything around was pierced by a red beam, which was the effect of one of the skills. One of the players joined in using his and mine to defeat the opponents and win at least this fight. The effects of the players' skills were incredible. They were in the form of beams of glowing spheres and some kind of flickering. Next, Ken Bach used a level 2 metal attribute, which greatly surprised his audience. It seemed like it was too early for this skill. Thanks to this action, he managed to win over several opponents and give his team a head start. He remembered that in order to restore chakra, he needed to attack enemies and knights, which he did, maintaining the necessary strength in himself. After a few seconds, his chakra restoration was complete. When he was attacked by the enemy team's players, he was prepared and was able to dodge their attacks in time. While in flight, he again used the necessary gestures to activate one of his character's skills. He used a 3rd level fire attribute, and everything around him swam. Fire rings scattered across the battlefield. With the help of the fiery explosion, he was able to hit several more opponents, who were immediately engulfed in flames. For this move, he received achievements in the game, which could affect his rating in the future. Not only did he interrupt his opponent's attacks, but he was also able to successfully select the right skill to deal damage to them. Thanks to this, he was able to get a double kill and bring his team closer to victory. The audience was amazed that Ken Bok was able to perform such an attack on this character, which became decisive in the fight. He waved to his team members and noted that he would take over the front and go to the other line. One of the participants noted how cool he was and thanked him for his help. Ken Bok made his way to the other line and noted that he began to understand some of the nuances of this game and understood how to use certain situations to his advantage. Remade saw another enemy and froze for a second, choosing the right moment to attack. In an instant, he dealt with another opponent, and it seemed like it was easy as pie for him. No one in the audience had ever heard of Ken Bok's character ever becoming a champion, but perhaps that could change now. After the attack, Ken Bok used another skill to restore his strength a little and slowly moved away in the other direction. But suddenly a notification came from the game that the enemy team decided to surrender. Ken Bok was a little upset. They didn't even have time to reach the enemy base. At the end of this match, the game counted the achievements. Ken Bok made 33 kills and did not die himself. Seeing this mark, he said that he did not even notice that he made so many kills. Ken Bok ruffled his hair a little awkwardly and apologized for having fun himself, explaining that he also wanted to give orders and participate in the team battle. The match was ending, and Ken Bok pointed out that there were only 4 wins left to complete the mission. After the first game he won, his rating should have increased a little, and therefore the next match should be even more interesting. He chose the same role again and came to life until the players were recruited. Although the comments said that Ken Bok was stupid for agreeing to such a mission without even the slightest training, the next game was also won. In the third game, Ken Bok's team destroyed the enemy team's temple, which also meant success. Ken Bok sat on top of his enemies, who were trapped in the net and could not get out of there. It was another winning match. It seemed that Ken Bok had no problem with the mission given to him. His team won as many as 4 times in a row. Byung-hun wasn't particularly surprised by what they saw on the screen and pointed it out to Ju-ho, who replied that he had once heard that their friend played well, but never thought it would be at such a high level. Ben-hun said it was a completely different level and it was like he was playing a different game. Ju-ho couldn't take his eyes off the screen, thinking only about how Kyung Bok was almost successful. Ben-hong stretched out in his chair and put his hands behind his head, reminding him that there had to be one more victory to complete the mission. At that moment, Ju-ho looked at him, suspected something, and asked again what was wrong. Byung-hun suddenly screamed and Ju-ho returned his gaze to the screen. Ken Bok ran along the path. He was a little confused, indicating that he missed the events by a second, and the top line was already lost. He noted for himself that the enemy opponent was apparently quite serious and immediately went on a gang. After reading the chat, he found out that one of his opponents was the streamer that everyone was buzzing about. This streamer played under the slogan, "If something works out, then he will definitely do it." His character was probably skilled at using cards, which were his weapons. He had 700,000 subscribers and was a guy who played at the genetic level. His name was Genome, and he was now Ken Bok's main target. His opponent had 4 games of platinum and a very high ranking, but Ken Bok ran towards him, convinced that he should beat him. Ben-hun was a little excited to learn that his friend had gotten into a match with such a streamer and was expecting them to clash. This streamer is very self-confident, and when addressing his viewers, he did not even imagine his defeat. He pointed out that he was 4th in platinum and asked if it wasn't obvious from his play. He was a complex gamer known as a guy who played well on a genetic level, and he found it funny to doubt him. Genome nervously replied that he was busy last season and therefore couldn't get to the diamond. Looking at the map, he concluded that the jungler on the white team should come to support and thought about how he would plan his route. Genome was in no hurry to rush off to look for him and decided to do a little pumping of his skills by killing mobs. Having quickly dealt with them, he moved forward and along the way decided to see which hero was in the role of jungler. He opened the characteristics and was very surprised and even doubted for a second that everything was shown correctly. He couldn't believe that the character here was actually Yami. Genome noted that this was a bit abnormal, and even if this is an entertaining stream, picking a troll at an important match was too much. He squeezed his card in his hand in anger. The game system indicated that the enemy team had destroyed one of the allied towers. He was indignant. Why was it necessary to create an aggression with such heroes in an important game? Because there should be a limit everywhere. Genome already received an application to take a mission for 10 Yami kills, indicating that he wanted another match with a reward for winning. Genome decided that it was his direct responsibility to deal with the upstart and make an entertaining documentary out of this. He deftly jumped from his place and rushed forward, using the corresponding acceleration skill. The chat was in complete disarray, and viewers were arguing among themselves. Kenbok tried not to pay attention and even tried to have fun. Suddenly, the chat was blocked, which surprised Kenbok greatly. He smiled and noted that as soon as the level became higher, everyone became more serious. If you try, then the blocking can probably be removed. He wondered if he killed his rival streamer, would the comments unlock faster after that? After which another mission proposal came to him and he smiled. Let's note that he just wanted to play, well, now it will be even more fun. He was showered with donations in large quantities, both from those who supported him and from those who did not believe in his success. Kenbok suggested going for a kill immediately before the difference in items appears, so as not to create a strong gap. Kenbok advanced along the line towards Genome and lay in wait in ambush. But after a while, Genome never showed up, although Kyungbok thought that he would immediately go gank and would be able to intercept him in this place. Looking at the map, he found that even Genome's position was not visible. But it was necessary to take into account that Genome was a magic shooter and he could not have hidden skills. After a not-so-long moment, the necessary thought reached him, but judging by the bright red Uchu that was directed straight at him, it was already too late. It rained cards from him, which were the weapons of the character Genome, but Kenbok was able to dodge each of them without taking any damage. Genome jumped down from behind the hill and carefully walked towards Kenbok, trying not to give away his presence too much. Coming closer, he loudly noted that Kenbok was very good at dodging, although he didn't understand how he managed to dodge the predictive arrow. Kenbok analyzed that if he hid behind a building, the enemy would not be able to see him, which meant that Genome could predict his movement in advance. Genome began to flip the deck of his killer cards in his hands. And after this gesture, he threw several of them at Kenbok using a certain skill. When Kenbok jumped very close to him, he emphasized that there were no personal intentions in this fight. Using another skill, he assured Kenbok that he was only following his instructions. The cards flew at Kenbok again like arrows, but he immediately gathered his energy into a ball and launched it back at his opponent. And I immediately used another skill to say that this speech also applied to him. With this power, he tried to throw the enemy as far as possible and inflict good damage. But Genome was no ordinary player, so he dodged this attack and threw his cards at Kenbok again. It was nice to watch their fight, as they both enjoyed it and smiled widely. At the scene of the fight, a powerful explosion occurred, which covered a large area. Kenbok and Genome continued to fight each other, not losing in skill and ability. Kenbok proved himself to be a very worthy opponent, although there were still those in the audience who doubted him. Genome took all the attacks with a smile, reflected them, and dealt his own blows. Some of them were quite unexpected for Kenbok, but he still managed to cope. Another attack from Genome caused another explosion, with Kenbok at the center. The chat noted that Yami's weak body had taken damage that was unlikely to be dodged. Genome waited for the flames to die down to see his opponent. But despite all the fears of the spectators, Kenbok survived and used his strength to jump to the side. He activated the first-level iron attribute, and his arm was irradiated into iron armor, which increased the damage of his attacks. He was completely focused on his movements and tried to use his strength as efficiently as possible. He then used the second-level tree attribute and blocked Genome with the help of the ghostly vines. Having received a lot of time, he immediately dealt an additional blow to him and ran to the side. The effects of the attributes passed and Genome broke free from the shackles and only laughed with Kenboka. In the chat, they noted that the level of fights between these two was really high, and they both managed to dodge at the last moment. For a very long time, they fought at the same level, and neither could cause significant damage to the other. Kenbok always looked only into the eyes of his opponent, tracking his every move. Kenbok noted the ability to use skills and kite Genome, and understood that if it continued like this, he would be in trouble. He had very little magical energy left, which was restored by normal attacks or over time. On the other hand, the distorted fate used randomly drawn Genome cards. They needed to be replenished at the base when the deck was running low, and that could give some time for Kenbok. However, Genome could still use Shuffle to replenish skills. Therefore, Genome could stay in a fight for a long time and did not need to run away to replenish his strength. It's more likely that he was simply stalling for time. He activated the Iron attribute, but due to a lack of mana, the duration was shortened, and in the chat it was noted that Genome had miscalculated. Kenbok quickly launched his attack and decided to get out of there as quickly as possible while he still had time. Kenbok understood that, unlike him, Genome only became stronger with each item he used. And now Kenbok had the perfect moment. Genome had recovered from the shock and was walking behind Kenbok. Kenbok grabbed his dagger, preparing to continue their fight. He decided that it would be worth using something else, and in the chat they immediately noticed his killer smile. I understand that he was planning something. Seeing Ken Bok preparing for a fight, Genome was surprised. You thought he had run out of mana a long time ago. But looking at how he used another skill, I thought that he used it to distract attention. I thought for a bit and decided that Ken Bok would immediately run away at the first opportunity. Genome also emphasized that his skills turned out to be better than he thought, but Yami's character still remained useless. In the streamer's chat, they wrote that Yami turned out to be somehow tough, and it was necessary to teach him a lesson, and Genome said that his body was so warmed up that it was time to finish off the enemy. He ran after Ken Bok through the forest. It was dangerous because there were many places in the forest that could be attacked from behind. He walked carefully on the ground, trying not to give away his presence and remain unnoticed as long as possible. He stopped in a spacious clearing. There was nothing around to indicate Ken Bok's presence, but he had his own thoughts on the matter. He thought that Ken Bok might be hiding in the bushes. But this was not at all convenient, because in this case his body and sound would disappear. But the sound of the bushes could give him away, and Genome launched his cards in the direction where his opponent could be. And at that moment, Ken Bok jumped out of those bushes, putting up a shield. Surprisingly, he was exactly where Genome expected. He deftly jumped over the enemy's attack and hid in another place. It was important for him to act according to such a strategy. Genome grinned and noted that it was very stupid to waste the barely restored mana. He was already jubilant. I think that victory over Ken Bok was already in his hands, and for the opponent, it was the complete end. But he was deeply mistaken. Blows began to rain down around him, and everything happened so quickly that it was impossible to notice Ken Bok himself. Genome began to shake his head. He was surprised because the character Yami did not have a split skill. Not only that what was happening was quite strange and unexpected. They were quiet for a long time, and Genome prepared a few more cards, roughly calculating where his enemy was hiding. Having launched the cards there, mutant rats poured out from there, but there was no trace of Ken Bok. But the sight of the monster of the thicket only made Genome laugh. The audience was surprised that this monster was here and wondered why he left his area. The monsters began to pounce on Genome, who did not quite expect this and was fixated on finding Ken Bok. He cursed, but it didn't frighten him, it just made him a little angry. He was upset that he missed, but at that moment Ken Bok himself jumped out of the bushes. He rose high above the ground and seemed to freeze in the air for a while. As he jumped, he prepared to use his skill and repeated the necessary gestures for this. In a second, he managed to get rid of all the monsters that were attacking his opponent and clear a path for himself. Genome was amazed that in such a short moment Ken Bok was able to restore all his chakra by attacking these monsters and use them as a distraction. Well, what happened next still managed to scare him. Ken Bok used the 5th level fire attribute, and everything around him was covered in flames. It was quite hot, and it was also very dangerous. It was a fire purification, and Ken Bok was not putting on any show, he was participating in a real fight. Genoma destroyed his self-confidence, but gave Ken Bok the ability to fulfill his mission. Immediately after completing the mission, Ken Bok's account was credited with more than 500,000 won in donations. The audience changed their minds and admired the game. Ken Bok thanked him for the donation and noted that the game was not over yet, and he should have returned to the battlefield. Back in the game world, he immediately heard the sounds of new notifications, which distracted him again. The team members wrote him apologies. They explained to him that he was blocked because he was mistaken for a troll. And after a few more apologies, they asked him to give them orders, considering that he was in the role of a forester. This made Ken Bok very happy, as it was possible to prove that he was capable of many things. He turned on his microphone and announced that he would give orders through it. Others followed his action, and he noted that now there was no need to respond or report the situation and be distracted by the chat. He emphasized that he would fly out for the map and the state and asked to simply focus on their lines and follow his orders. When everyone had set up the connection, Ken Bok ordered the game to begin and ran forward. He ordered to demolish one line before the revival of the genome, then it was worth using this time as effectively as possible. When Genome respawned, he immediately saw several notifications about the deaths of his teammates. He admired Ken Bok's ability to hide his position for a gank. Ken Bok was now a true master of stealth and an elusive spirit who could read the entire map in detail and warn his allies of dangers. After reading the notification from his allies, Genome noted that it was worth monitoring the situation and sped up, running to help. He understood that such a reaction was to be expected and that the white team's actions had changed dramatically was obvious. Genome emphasized that a forester who also gave orders was a great rarity in this game and had not been seen for a long time. Making my way to my team, he was very careful because now the situation had changed for the worse for them. He made his way through the forest, having a certain plan on how he could correct the current situation. He decided to set a trap. It was necessary to do it in such a way that no one would notice it and would not be able to avoid it in the future. He installed transparent stone all over the map. His allies were a little outraged. Was it really possible to use a transparent stone instead of objects? But they trusted him. They knew how experienced a player he was. That's why Genome never really paid attention to negative comments, because he was confident in what he was doing. Once he had established everything that was required, he notified the team that they should get together. He also stressed that if they don't kill Yami, they will lose this match. If you killed the wanted person who had the most kills in a row, you could transfer the kill to their side and instantly turn the game around. Traps were a very good item that could actually be a game changer in extreme cases. Ken Bach also used the transparent stone for his own purposes. In the chat, his viewers noted that although he was inexperienced, he still understood how to use them. He thought that control items of destruction and evasion were classics, but this was something incredible. He set up small traps in certain places in one of the clearings, and thus managed to create one huge trap from which it was almost impossible to escape. His shamanic sense kicked in again, and he felt a sharp sense of danger from all sides. It was easy to guess that the entire enemy team was approaching him. This was exactly what Kyungbok expected, since he had been preparing well for their meeting for some time. It was clear that the entire enemy team, under Genome's orders, came to kill him, because now he was the main danger. Indeed, the entire enemy team had gathered together and were searching for Ken Bach. There was no other option for them to defeat him. No one could handle him alone. While they were searching for Ken Bach, Genome gave them instructions on how they should act when they encountered their enemy. He tried to build the best plan that would make the most effective use of all the players' skills. He believed that he would definitely be able to dodge the enemy's attacks, so they needed to combine all their attacks to quickly deal with Ken Bach. The fight quickly broke out. It was quite dynamic and brutal. All 5 players pounced on one Ken Bach and were confident that with this strategy they would be able to kill him. Having agreed, they used their skills according to a certain algorithm, which was supposed to first neutralize Ken Bach and then inflict enormous damage on him. Ken Bach was prepared and knew what he had to do to ensure that his opponent's plan was destroyed. Of course, the sight of all the characters who had taken such a huge power together was terrifying, and for a moment Ken Bach became nervous. Among his viewers, there was one who wrote that it was time to admit the failure of the mission and run away. But Juho, who was now working as a manager, immediately deleted the comment. Ken Bach was only amused by such comments and was given more motivation to prove who he was and show it in practice. He used level 4 water elements and a huge powerful wave crashed down on his enemies. Genome screamed, trying to gather his allies together. He tried to give orders to his teammates, still hoping to defeat Ken Bach. He ordered someone to heal their wounds, so the ambassador is trying to squeeze out maximum efficiency in the current situation to support other characters. Ken Bach held his ground and successfully repelled the attacks of his enemies, although it was actually quite difficult. The chat was full of laughter at the enemy team, who couldn't catch one Yami with the whole pack. It was really funny. The fight was not over, and it was impossible to predict whether they would be able to defeat the enemy or suffer defeat themselves. Genome put his cards forward and announced that he would lure the movement and action of the ideal player. At that moment, Ken Bach used the second-level earth element, and the earth burst out huge, sharp stone spikes, which might clay to bear great damage and block the enemy's movement. Having understood the head, Ken Bach saw right in front of him one of the cards issued by Genome and was surprised, because it couldn't be that he got the Queen of Hearts again. According to Ken Bach's observations, this card had already been used, and it was unclear how Genome pulled it out of the deck again. Genome smiled and used his ultimate skill, Distorted Fate. The Joker in his deck of cards was responsible for this skill. He stood in the thick of all the events happening in the clearing and did not shuffle his cards. He used skill after skill, trying to gain an advantage in the fight against Ken Bach. Ken Bach was immobilized. Genome's abilities made him freeze in place with no way to break the control. Looking at his enemy hanging in the air, Genome emphasized that air can also be an ideal prison. After that, he ordered his entire team to use the ultimate skill with which they could achieve victory. He gave the command for everyone to go together and for everyone to use their skills at the same time, but suddenly, he became silent. Ken Bach, completely immobilized, laughed loudly. It was unsettling because in his situation, this was not the emotion that needed to be felt. Ken Bok laughed and used the 5th-level Earth element and applied it to himself. Genome froze. He was shocked by what his opponent had done. Neither he nor his team as a whole could have expected such a development. Thanks to this skill, Ken Bok was able to free himself from the control, although he lost a large percentage of his health and mana. Genome became very nervous. He was confused by what he saw and forgot a little that he should continue the attack. He shouted that Ken Bok had no health, and it would only take one hit to finish him off. He stepped forward, pressing his foot hard into the ground. Suddenly, the viewer's screen went completely black and everyone was worried that something had happened to the broadcast. But soon everything was restored, and they saw a frightened Genome, who could not move from his place. Ken Bok used his ultimate ability, Ami, which created complete darkness around him. This skill absorbed the health of enemies within the dark ball and converted it into health and chakra. There were certain activation conditions for this skill. To begin with, it was worth using techniques of all 5 elements at the 4th level or higher. It was amazing that someone was able to successfully do this in virtual reality. With this skill, Ken Bok managed to make 4 kills in a row. The last of the team was Genome, who tried to jump back from the dark matter released by Ken Bok. Well, it was clear from his eyes that he no longer had any hope of being saved. In front of him, he saw Ken Bok, who in a split second was supposed to deliver the final blow to him and prove his superiority. Many in the chats were surprised that the character Yami even had an ultimate ability, and on top of that, it turned out to be so strong. The next move, Ken Bok delivered the finishing blow to Genome. In this way, he managed to completely disable the entire enemy team and buy a lot of time for his own. The game system offered the opposing team to respawn at the base or surrender. Meanwhile, Ken Bok received new achievements for the murder he committed. Genome's allies believed that they should have surrendered, since the map showed that the enemy was approaching their base and it still meant their defeat. Genome couldn't believe it and doubted whether he should press the button to surrender. He noted that it was a rather dangerous situation. If they simply lost, they would be ashamed in front of the team. But nevertheless, refusing to meet with a dangerous enemy was also very offensive. Meanwhile, Ken Bok reached the enemy camp and asked his team to teleport to him using an item. He asked his allies to ignore the enemy and focus on capturing the temple, while Genome asked his allies to immediately defend their temple after respawning. The teleportation of Ken Bok's allies and the revival of the opponents happened simultaneously. Everyone was wondering where each other's limit was. The battle continued. The atmosphere was quite tense. Each of the opponents wanted to prove their superiority and successfully complete their missions. Ken Bok sat on one of the rocks near the enemy base and prepared to attack. He smiled and tasted his victory in his mouth. As soon as his allies got to him, they began the attack. He used the 1st-level Earth element, with which he also incapacitated one of the opponents by squeezing him in a stone fist. The team immediately lost one ally and was significantly weakened. Ken Bok, without wasting time, ran further towards the others. They were waiting for him, but everyone understood perfectly well that meeting him could mean imminent death. One of the opponents tried to identify him by the smell that came with his skills. Well, that couldn't help him, because Ken Bok was still using the power of the earth. A huge stone hand slowly approached the enemy from behind and was about to grab him. When the enemy saw it, it was already too late. Ken Bok smiled contentedly, noting his success. Having scanned the space with the help of my senses, I discovered from which direction the threat was coming. It was easy to guess that this threat was Genome, who was thirsty for revenge. But when he saw Ken Bok, he was a little taken aback. He didn't think that the enemy's skill had reached this level, so when he saw the enemy moving on a stone hand, he involuntarily shuddered. He tried to exhale and emphasize that it was worth thinking only about the positive. With all his fears, he smiled and said that for this reason he returned. He threw his cards forward, but it couldn't help him. Everything around him burst into flames, and he began to turn his head to see his enemy in this flame and not let him get too close. But the mistake was that his house exploded, and the search for enemies was already pointless. His allies gasped in shock, as Genome was supposed to be protecting their base. Genome noted that this had been a high-risk tactic to begin with, but now it was a reality. He desperately closed his eyes, admitting defeat to himself and his team, and inside he felt empty. The next match ended in victory. Ken Bok managed to complete the task of 5 victories in a row. Agent Q, who gave this mission, dropped another small donation and asked if there were games that Ken Bok couldn't play, to which he replied that he didn't know of any such games yet and smiled broadly. He tried to correct his words, saying that there were simply a lot of games that he hadn't played, but he decided not to make excuses and simply laughed along with his viewers. Many of the players he was in the match with immediately sent him a friend request, noting that his game was simply incredible. Kenbok smiled confusedly and said that he didn't know what the rank would be, so he would have to decline the friend request and immediately apologized for it. Scrolling down a little bit, Kenbok opened his eyes wide in surprise because he received a friend request from Genome himself. Along with the application, Genome sent Kenbok a video message asking him to watch it. Kenbok was confused and very carefully pressed the screen to launch the message, although he felt some tension at that moment. Genome apologized to Perfect Play for mistaking Yami's choice of hero for trolling for his unpleasant behavior and asked for the opportunity to apologize in person. He asked to accept his friend request and play together sometime and once again. Kenbok smiled. Let's note that the streamer was a good person and accepted this request. He noted that a player of such level was always welcome, but suddenly something confused him very much. A large number of new notifications were heard. A lot of users switched to his stream from Genome. Kenbok greeted everyone and thanked them and asked them to follow the chat rules. Kenbok was happy because thanks to the people who came from Genome's stream, the number on his stream exceeded 3,000. Exhaling, he suggested that everyone complete the entrance examinations and activated the continuation of the game. Meanwhile, the Genome stream was finished and disconnection from the capsule was expected. Waking up in his capsule, Nam Ji-hwan, who was Genome, asked his manager how everything went. He noted that he had received a friend request. Ji-hwan, sitting on the edge of his capsule, was very happy about this. The manager noted that Genome was very worried about Perfect Play, which he explained that there were very few people of this type, and that with such skills, Kenbok would quickly become popular. Genome pulls himself up shared that he was worried about possible criticism for the inconsistency of the stream level, but everything worked out. But the manager noted that such a proposal should have been approached very carefully. He looked at him in surprise and asked what problems there could be with all this. They became a little tense. The manager explained that he continued watching Perfect Play's stream until it ended. And hesitating a bit, he pointed out that Genome would most likely not be the main character, but a secondary one. This was a real shock for both of them. Meanwhile, the rating challenge was completed and Kenbok reached the diamond rating, which amazed all his viewers. He thanked everyone for their congratulations and invited them to try playing with Yami, convincing them that it was not difficult. He pointed out that there were more than 2,000 of them and once again thanked the viewers for staying with him and promised to meet on the next stream. Ben-hun was in high spirits and didn't mind the fact that he had a long night of work ahead of him. He was absolutely delighted with the thought of it and the results it would bring. He was screaming with emotion and wanted to get it all out as quickly as possible. He always reacted to things like this. Juho didn't seem to express any emotions and silently watched his friend deep in his thoughts. Some time ago, he felt in one filming, and he had to be in the role of a victim who was attacked by a group of guys. The camera stopped filming and everyone was notified that the scene had been filmed. Kenbok and Ben-hun were sure that this would definitely go to the school board. It was a masterpiece among masterpieces, and Ben-hun was happy that he had his first portfolio. Byung-hun and Kyung-bok filmed this fight from above, remaining unnoticed for a long time by the guys who were trying to beat up Juho. The attackers started shouting at them, ordering them to leave quickly. Juho froze in place, glad that he hadn't managed to get hit hard by them. In the video, the boys noticed a badge on Juho's uniform, noting that it could help them a lot. Without thinking, Kenbok jumped down to the guys who were beating up Juho, realizing that the situation was getting out of control and it was time to do something. When Kyung-bok came downstairs, Juho asked him to never give him such roles again in his life. Upon landing, Kenbok noted that it would be difficult to control his temper and not make the situation worse than it was. The attacking guys grimaced because Kenbok was very familiar. I don't understand that he represented a high danger. One of them called Kenbok a shaman and asked the others not to mess with him, apparently knowing what he was capable of. The boys ran away, outraged that those filming the video thought that the school bullying advice was a trifle. Byung-hun didn't put his cameras down and laughed at the guys who thought they could win this fight. All this time, Juho stood silently and tried to contain his emotions. Kenbok approached him and asked what media he liked and suggested making a list. And Ben-hun noted that he was a master of attracting attention on the internet and would make everyone impressed. Juho finally managed to smile. The boys then helped him a lot and became good friends with him. And until now, Juho believed that as long as he was with them, he would never be bored. Ben Hong presented his laptop to the guys with a very satisfied expression and asked if they liked the reaction. Ben Hun smiled. Let's note that not working at night with such a hit was a sin. It turned out that the fight with Genome became a topic on the forums, and a bunch of new viewers appeared on their new video. Thanks to this entry, the number of subscribers to the arrest increased and would soon reach 170,000. Although this was a known fact for the friends, they still looked at each other in surprise. Then Juho noticed that they had an important matter to discuss and fell silent for a moment. He stated that they had received an official letter from the Genome team, who requested a personal meeting. He showed the tablet and noted that Genome even attached a video of an apology to the letter, so there was no need to worry too much. But they wanted not only to apologize and become friends, but also to have a joint stream. Ben Hun laughed and said that he was a long-lived streamer and that all streamers always had one good skill, which was a keen eye. Ben Hun was happy, noting that more and more famous people recognized the genius of their friend Ken Bok. Ken Bok asked if it meant that they wanted to do a collab in Mystic. Juho explained that they wanted to invite him as a guest to discuss game content and noted the master's anatomy. The name sounded very strange. The point was that they invited a master with good skills from whom Genome learned to their stream. As the guest increased his fame and Genome demonstrated his physical skills, both remained winners. And judging by this, Ken Bok should have taught them to play Bark. But Juho noted that this time it was the other way around, and Genome wanted to become the master and teach Kyung Bok the skill of playing Gunner Ground. Ken Bok was uneasy about Genome being the stream host and him being the apprentice, as it seemed very suspicious. Ben Hun just smiled and noted that Genome had simply realized something. He noted to himself that Genome probably wouldn't be able to reproduce the perfect play game. The three of them came to the conclusion that in any case, there was no reason to refuse a joint stream, and it was worth seizing this opportunity and accepting the offer. Ken Bok thought a little more and finally became convinced that a joint stream with a person like Genome would only benefit him. Ken Bok started the next stream as usual with a friendly greeting and waited a bit for the viewers to join in and respond in the comments. He also paid attention to the characteristics of the broadcast and felt a little excited because from the first minutes the number of viewers was almost 3,000. It was not similar to the previous broadcasts. The chat began to suspect that he had prepared something new for them, and Ken Bok confirmed this, saying that he wanted to try a new game. Smiling, he happily announced that he had a planned joint stream with Genome at Gunner Ground. You expect all viewers to really like this news. Opening the game launch window, Ken Bok noted that given the fact that he didn't know anything, holding a joint event would be inappropriate, so he wanted to practice a little. He launched the game and began to understand its essence. It was necessary to become the last survivor out of the other 100 players. It was a survival game. The game started with all the players who were on the team descending to the ground from the sky. It was quite unexpected, and Ken Bok was jokingly scared by this effect, seeing that he was at such a great height. In the chat, he was warned that if he was careless, he could die before the farm even started, so he should pay more attention to everything that was happening. Some of the players opened their parachutes and started shouting some unintelligible things. Ken Bok Dad just looked around and tried to understand the situation. As he approached the ground, he came to his senses and asked the audience if he could die if he landed incorrectly. In the chat, he was advised to go straight to the warehouse, although, of course, he didn't know where it was. Some viewers started joking about this, which raised some doubts about such advice. After studying the map, Ken Bok found the location of the warehouse and tried to speed up his landing. He tried to level out and was flying upside down, still not opening his parachute, unlike the other players. In the chat, people started to worry about this and asked why the altitude warning didn't work when the parachute had to be opened. Some noted that Ken Bok did not have a special setting, which he apparently forgot to turn on after the Mystic. It seemed that Ken Bok was doing everything intuitively, and in the chat they predicted his death immediately upon landing, because if he had not immediately corrected the situation, he would have had no other option.